This Tuesday, February 2nd, 2021, special meeting of the Scottsdale Unified Number 48 Governing Board will come to order. The time is 5 p.m. Vice President Sinowski, will you please lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The board will now have a roll call, starting from the chair's left.
Zach Lindsay.
Libby Hart-Wells.
Patty Beckman.
Julie Sinowski.
Jan Michael Greenberg. All board members are present and there is a quorum. The board will now move to agenda item 2D, approval of the agenda. Are there any desired changes to the current agenda as presented? The chair moves to approve the agenda as presented. Is there a second? Vice President Sinowski seconds. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion carries 5-0. The board will now move to agenda item 3, superintendent's comments. Dr. Menzel.
Good evening, President Greenberg, Vice President Sinowski, members of the governing board. Thank you for being here tonight where we get to celebrate Vice President Sinowski's birthday. And we do not divulge ages, but happy birthday. And we'll also forego singing at this point.
That's good, thank you.
And then I also would like to note that board member Lindsay also has a birthday coming up on Sunday, so happy birthday coming up this weekend. I have 3 things to update the board on this evening, and we also have a full agenda, so I'll try to be brief. The first is that on January 26th, we reached the 100th day count for ADM purposes, and in Arizona, that's a significant marker. We were down 850 students from last year's 100th day count, which represents just over 3.5% reduction in the number of students. It's on par with what some of our other NEVIC counterparts have experienced. They've ranged from 2 to some places close to 10% decline in student enrollment. And across the state of Arizona, there's been a pretty precipitous drop in the number of students. And so that is one of the side effects of the COVID situation. And our hope is that as we head into the next school year, we'll be able to recapture many of those students. And as you know, in the budget presentation that Shannon will be reviewing, we have accounted for the drop of students that we've seen. The second point is one that's an emerging development here. As you know, during the course of COVID, we've had a number of pilot projects that have allowed us to be able to test something out before we go to scale. We started with the pilot project at Cheyenne back in the fall with respect to the cameras and how that worked and their full day schedule. After that, all of the K-8s went to the full day schedule. We recently received a proposal from Mountainside Middle School to consider moving to a full day schedule there. And there are a couple of things that I think are important to note related to that proposal and the reason why Cabinet supported moving forward with the pilot project. First, as you know, Mountainside Middle School is a middle years program, and they're the only school that's got an 8-period school day. So it creates a very different structure on our 2/3 day schedule at Mountainside Middle School. Additionally, when you think about what it takes to go from our 2/3 schedule and the reasons why we have that, and that is to avoid having lunch during this time of substantial community spread, I asked Dr. Sonnenschein specifically, post-vaccine, is there any other thing that you're concerned about related to a full day schedule? And she again said, lunch, unless you can maintain the 6 feet of physical distancing. And so one of the criteria that we had in considering a potential pilot proposal was the ability to address that physical distancing during lunch. I suspect many of you have been to the Mountainside Middle School campus, but they actually have the capacity physically to be able to spread out on the campus. Arizona has beautiful weather in March and April, and so we can use the outdoor. We have got a plan during the pilot project to be able to use some of the staff from Desert Mountain High School to help with outdoor supervision so we can manage some of that. Part of the reason why we like to look at pilot projects in a situation like this is it allows us to identify what works and what doesn't work to make improvements when we move towards a full day for all of our secondary sites. So we believe that the pilot project accounts for the 6 feet of separation necessary at lunch, and it won't start until more than 7 days after the second dose of the Pfizer vaccine, which is the time necessary for the vaccine to be fully effective. And so we took all those things into consideration and have recommended that they proceed. The other part that I think is really important here is it's 2 weeks before spring break. That 2-week window gives us an opportunity to really assess what worked, what didn't work, what might we need to tweak, so that we could consider having all of our secondary schools return to a full schedule when we come back from spring break in March. So that's my current thinking at the moment. Obviously, we can discuss this at the February 16th meeting if the board is so inclined. But the plan at this point is to start the pilot project on February 22nd with the intent of learning as much as we can over that 2-week period of time so that we can be prepared for a full return for the fourth quarter. The final piece of information tonight is, as you know, while much of our time this year has been spent on addressing COVID-related challenges, we also want to turn our attention to the future of Scottsdale Unified School District. And so we've engaged a consultant on the strategic planning process, and we are very close to being able to finalize the strategic planning design team. That'll be somewhere between 40 and 45 individuals, both internal and external stakeholders with diverse representation from across our 5 learning communities, in order to be able to help engage our community, identifying what the hopes and aspirations are and what it is that we want for our students here in Scottsdale Unified. We're a district that has the ability to compete with anyone in the world, and what we need is to be clear about our mission, vision, core values, and the direction we're heading so that we can all be pulling in the same direction. So I'm pretty excited that in the midst of COVID, we're going to be able to start having these substantive conversations about the future. I think that's inspirational, at least for me, because it's really the core work when we get down to the business of teaching and learning and how do we ensure every student in Scottsdale Unified School District is able to achieve their full potential. So with that, that'll conclude my report this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Menzel. Oh, apologies. Thank you, Dr. Menzel. The board will now move to agenda item 4A, review of fiscal year 2019-2020, district and procurement outside audit and CAFR. Dr. Menzel.
Shannon Crozer will introduce our guest presenter as we walk through the financial audit presentation this evening.
Yes, so tonight we have joining us Dennis Osich. He is our lead auditor with Clifton Larson Allen. It's a different auditor than what we've had in the past, so we're excited about how that process went, and he's going to be presenting. We actually had audits done, the single audit, procurement audit, which was under our AG agreement, as well as our just regular annual audit that they go through. In addition to that is the comprehensive annual financial reports, which you all received copies of all 3 of those audits and the CAFR in your packet as well. So with that,
All right, thank you, Shannon. Thank you, the board, for having me here today. As Shannon had mentioned, I'm going to go through just the results of the audit and the different engagements that we did as part of that audit. So these are the reports that you should have in your packet. So the governance communication, some of that is what I'm going to be talking about today. That's basically a letter talking about our responsibility, management's responsibility. I'll go through some of the highlights of that as well. The comprehensive annual financial report, which is the big report that you see related to the district. We also did the audit of the Scottsdale Trust, which is a separate audit report, and then it's incorporated into the comprehensive annual financial report. As Shannon had mentioned, the single audit report, and then also the Usfr Questionnaire, which is like a 40-page questionnaire that's required by the Auditor General. Solely compliance, no opinion that we provide on that. It's basically yes or no answers. So I'll talk about that a little bit. And then finally, the Procurement Agreed upon procedures. So I'll go through each one of these in a little bit more detail. But just to give you a little bit of background, as Shannon had mentioned, this is our first year doing the audit for Scottsdale Unified. So this is sort of what our schedule looked like at a very high level. So we had about 1 to 2 weeks of planning and off-site work. 1 week on site, and then we came back for final work, which was about 2 to 3 weeks that was off site, and then 1 week on site. Even before the pandemic started, we started going a lot more toward not necessarily remote audit, but doing some of the items where we would just be taking up space and taking up staff time and doing that from the office, we developed our own proprietary portal. It's a secure portal where information can be uploaded, which allowed us to be able to do a lot of the work off-site, which really helped the audit because it helped our team, it helped the school district staff really focus on the things that were important and the questions that we actually had, rather than sitting in a conference room for weeks on end, taking up space and asking questions. The last thing I had listed on here, maybe not as important to you, but this is just what we had budgeted as far as hours and where we ended up actual hours. You can see we were over budget. That was expected for the first year because there's a learning curve. And so we budgeted for that, planning on, that we would be over budget, knowing that we wanted to gain some of that insight into the district, get an understanding of the controls, the operations. And there was a little bit of additional hours as well related to the trust, just because the trust had changed with the employee benefit basically being incorporated into the trust. So that was a few additional hours related to the trust, just getting an understanding of that and incorporating that into the financial statements. So I'm just going to take a look at a glance at each one of these reports. I know one of the members here had submitted some questions. Hopefully, I'll answer some of those questions as we go through. But feel free to stop me at any time if there's any clarification that you need, because the purpose of this is I'm reporting back to you. So I put together some of the information that I thought would be important, but if I'm not hitting on some of those items, I'm more than happy to answer those. So the governance communication, really that's just the letter explaining some of the significant items in the financial statements, some of our communication. So in preparing the financial statements, there are certain estimates that go into that. So we want to disclose that to the users, or really to governance, so that when you're looking at the financial statements, you realize that these are estimates that are going in there. So these are some of the estimates, the useful lives of the capital assets. Obviously, that affects the valuation of it because it affects the depreciation. The unfunded pension and OPEB liability, those are done by actuaries through the Arizona State Retirement System. The allocation of program revenues to the various expense functions that you'll see on the government-wide financial statements. Compensated absences, the fair value of investments, and then for the trust, the IBNR, which is claims incurred but not yet reported, that is also an estimate in the financial statements. So we had no difficulties in performing the audit, which is great, especially for a first-year audit. We did have 2 uncorrected misstatements. So I want to explain exactly what those are. Sometimes uncorrected misstatements are intentionally left uncorrected, and sometimes they're just small dollar amounts that aren't material for the users of the financial statements that went uncorrected. So the 2 items that we had one was related to a cash balance where the cash balance on the general ledger did not agree to the ultimate reconciliations. We tested that pretty in detail, and what it appeared to us is that this was really a balance carryover from the prior year that was potentially misstated in the prior year. We left it uncorrected because it was not material to the financial statements. It wouldn't affect the users of the financial statements. And the reason that we did is because we couldn't clearly identify exactly how to correct it. But I will be meeting with Shannon. We're going to talk about what to look for because essentially and Shannon and I had previously set up a meeting scheduled for tomorrow to go over sort of a closeout and talk about the audit and, where, we could see some improvements. And this is one of the items on the list because what we'd like to see is looking at some of the reconciliations and seeing that variance basically stayed the same over several months. So that then we feel comfortable with making that correction going forward. The other item was related to a capital lease. Capital leases are supposed to be reported as a liability on the financial statements. However, as you well know, in school districts, copiers are changed out all the time. And so this is one of those items where I said it was intentionally not recorded as a liability because it is difficult when those copiers get changed out all the time. There's always new lease agreements. And so because it wasn't material to the financial statements, instead it's still in there. It's just expensed rather than basically being recorded as a principal expense over a 5-year period. And then we did have two material audit adjustments, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. No disagreements with management. We did get representation from management regarding what was disclosed in the financial statements. And then there was no consultation with management with any other independent accountants as it related to the audit we were doing. So a few of the highlights on the comprehensive annual financial report. We did issue an unmodified opinion, which is a clean opinion, which means that the financial statements were reported in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. The district did receive the GFOA and ASBO certificates of achievement for 2019, and those applications were submitted for the 2020 as well, and we fully expect that the district will receive awards for the 2020 audit as well. During the year, there was $54.5 million in school improvement bonds that were issued, $9 million in bonds issued to refund $10 million in order to obtain a savings. And then there was an $8.5 million decrease in the net pension liability. So that's the Arizona State Retirement pension liability. So the single audit report, we issued two reports in the single audit. We issue one, which is called the Government Auditing Standards Report, and we don't give an opinion. But what we do instead is we report on internal controls. So if we had any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, those would be reported. And we did have one significant deficiency and one material weakness, again, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then the second report is the Uniform Grant Guidance Report. And that we do give an opinion on. We give an opinion on compliance. And what that is that is our opinion on compliance with major federal programs. So we identify major federal programs. So these are federal expenditures on federal awards that you receive. And we test for certain compliance requirements related to those awards that you received. And then we give an opinion. And we gave a clean opinion or unmodified opinion on compliance. And we had no control deficiencies related to controlled over compliance. The Scottsdale Insurance Trust, we issued a clean opinion or an unmodified opinion on that. We did have one material weakness that we reported related to that, and that was just related to some material audit adjustments that we had, and mostly what that related to was the employee benefit piece of it. And because of changing with Kairos, managing it, there was just some activity related to some of the claims that needed to be adjusted within the financial statements. And then finally, the Procurement Agreed Upon Procedures. So this is required by the Arizona Attorney General. Because it's an agreed upon procedures, we don't give an opinion. But instead what we do is we have procedures that are agreed upon that basically say exactly what we're going to do. And if we had anything that strayed from those procedures, we would report that as a finding. And those procedures are approved by the Attorney General. And they did approve the format of the report as well. So again, no opinion, but we did have no findings related to that procurement. And I'll talk a little bit about what exactly at a high level those procedures were and how many, basically what the population of and what the sample was that we looked at. So again, on the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, we gave a clean opinion. You'll also see in there that we provided what's called an in relation to opinion on the combining and individual non-major financial statements. Basically what that means is that in the basic financial statements, there is a certain criteria for funds to be considered major funds. And so we give an opinion on those major funds. Everything else that doesn't meet that criteria, they're all combined into a non-major on the basic financial statements. And so we're giving an opinion on the non-major as they relate to the basic financial statements. So not on each individual fund within the non-major governmental funds, but all of those funds individually, we're saying, are properly stated as they relate to the basic financial statements themselves. And then we disclaim an opinion on the required supplementary information, introductory section, and statistical section. And what that means is that we don't give an opinion. And the reason we don't is because the required supplementary information is generally multi-year trend information, or it's management's discussion and analysis where they're talking about some of the changes within the financial statements. The introductory section is more historical and about the district. And then the statistical section is generally 10 years worth of trend data. And so we can't give an opinion on 10 years worth of information. We do read that information, and we read management's discussion and analysis. We look at what's included in the transmittal letter. We also look at the statistical information, and we do make sure that it's basically tying out to what's reported in the financial statements, and there's nothing unusual within there, but we don't give an opinion on it. So when we do the financial statement audit, it is a risk-based approach, and what that means is that when we gain an understanding of the district, we look at it and we identify where are the higher risks that a misstatement could occur. And you know, when you hear the word risk, it sounds like a bad thing, but it's not. Every organization has risk. It doesn't mean that something, you know, is going to go wrong, but there is a higher risk in different areas. So the areas that we identified is management override of controls, and essentially what that is an opportunity where management could make changes to the financial statements or make changes within the system and override the system itself. And so we've designed procedures to specifically address that, as well as revenue recognition. Cash and investments, just because obviously cash and investments are susceptible to theft or fraud. And then capital assets, because there was a finding that we identified in the previous year, 2019, we did identify capital assets as being a higher risk and performed additional procedures there. And then year-end cutoff, so basically recording revenues and expenses in the correct fiscal year. So the single audit report, again, the government auditing standards report, we don't provide an opinion. We just report on internal controls. So we had one material weakness, and that material weakness was related to a restatement of the financial statements that had to be done. So when reading through the bond documents, we noted that there was one bond that was issued about 9 years ago that actually had sinking fund requirements. And what that means is that normally when you issue a bond, you make principal and interest payments to pay down the liability. What the sinking fund is you're actually making a payment every year, but you're placing it into an account to basically pay the bonds when they ultimately mature. And what we found is that in prior years that those payments were actually being recorded to reduce the principal liability. So the principal liability was understated. When in fact what should have been recorded is the principal balance should have remained the same, and there should have been an asset account for the investments that were held in the sinking fund. And so that was the restatement that was done for that. And then the significant deficiency that we had was related to capital assets. So there was two items that we noted. There was some retainage that was recorded as a capital asset addition this year that was actually already recorded in the previous year that we had to back out. And then the other item was there was a significant number of deletions in 2019, and in the initial capital asset schedules that we received, we saw that there was another big group of deletions noted. And so when we looked into it and we worked with management, what we found is that those were the same deletions that were deleted in the previous year, so we had to remove those. So that was the adjustment related to capital assets. The other report, as I mentioned, is the Uniform Grant Guidance Report. We do provide an opinion on compliance. No opinion on controls, so just like the Government Auditing Standards Report, but we would report on it. So if we had any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, we'd report on that. And again, we had no findings related to compliance for major federal programs. And then you'll also see in there, we also give an opinion on the schedule of federal expenditures. It's, again, in relation to opinion. So it's as it relates to the basic financial statements. And we issued a clean opinion on that as well. So these were the programs, the federal programs that we looked at during the year that were considered major federal programs, the Child Nutrition Cluster, and then a new grant, which was the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Program, which is the CARES money that was received during the year. And those two programs accounted for 35% of the district's federal expenditures. So for low-risk entities, and you have to meet certain criteria to be considered a low-risk entity for a single audit. And it's based on the last 2 years' audits. The district was a low risk, and so as a low risk, we had to test at least 20%. So we were well over that 20% coverage. And then as mentioned, we issued a clean opinion and no findings related to that. The Uniform System of Financial Records, the USFR questionnaire I referred to, again, no opinion. It's basically yes or no questions that we answer. We submit that electronically to the Auditor General. And then in the areas really that we noted some exceptions was related to cash and revenues, and that related to timeliness of deposits. The criteria is they should be deposited within 7 days. In most cases, it was 8 to 10 days that we found where we've had some deficiencies that we noted, so that was the no answer. Property control, and that was related to tags. We selected a sample of assets from the capital asset listing and went and found them in the district and identified the tag number, and there were some assets that either didn't have the tags listed or the tag numbers didn't match up. And then we also selected assets that were out at the district and then came back and tied them back to the listing and identified a few that had some discrepancies there. Student attendance reporting. I don't remember specifically, but if there are questions on it, I can definitely answer those. I've got a summary of the student attendance reporting, but there were just various findings related to attendance, where entry dates didn't necessarily agree to the entry form. So typical things that you find in a school district, so nothing really out of the ordinary. And then the last one was in transportation support. The district should be reporting miles traveled for transportation for students. They should be reporting actual miles, and the way that it was being calculated was basically just an estimate based on every Tuesday and Thursday miles, and so that was the finding related there. And then we got the Scottsdale Trust. Again, we audit the basic financial statements. There is some supplementary information, which is the management discussion analysis, which we disclaim an opinion on. A couple highlights. The ending net position was about $49.5 million, which was about a $5.2 million increase. So again, that $49.5 million, some of that is a significant carryover from prior years, and I believe from when we've done the audit in the past, I think a large portion of that dates back probably about 20 years. And it has to do with, I believe, a sale of a building or something like that. And then there's about $51.9 million that's in cash and investments. And generally in that fund, you are going to see a balance being carried because it is, for the employee benefits, it is self-insured. And so you do need to have those reserves available for any type of significant claims that may go above and beyond coverage. And then, as I mentioned previously, we had one material weakness. So the procurement agreed upon procedures. So these are the areas that we looked at a very high level. All major construction projects over $1 million, all architects and engineers, all sole source and emergency purchases, all cooperative purchases greater than $100,000, and then all procurements that exceeded $100,000. And again, these were dictated by the Attorney General. So these were procedures that were basically designed between us, the district, and the Attorney General, who the Attorney General ultimately approved. So we had no findings. So just to give you an idea of what we looked at, there was one major construction project over $1 million. And this is, again, these are for any RFPs or any transactions that occurred during the year. Not that you spent it during the year. So you may have spent more than $1 million on various projects, but they may have been procured in previous years. We're only looking at procurements that occurred during the year. No architects or engineers, again, that were done through procurement. There may have been some that were done through a cooperative, but not through a procurement. 4 sole source procurements that we looked at, no emergency purchases, and then there was 51 contracts through 5 cooperative purchases that exceeded $100,000 that we looked at, and then 3 procurements that exceeded $100,000. So all in all, no findings related to any of those, so that's really good. And then these last few slides are just some upcoming GASBs. So these are some of the new standards that are coming out. You'll see old dates on these. All of these were pushed back 1 year. There was a GASB that was issued that pushed back the implementation of these. So one of them that's coming up is the fiduciary activity, which will have an impact on student activities that we'll talk to Shannon about. And then we'll have leases coming up in a couple years. So that's not too far off. So at this point, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you. Do any governing board members have any questions? Board member Beckman.
I just have a few. And Shannon may need to answer this. For the bond issuance that happened 9 years ago, what happened this year to make us catch it? And why wasn't that the sinking fund issue caught in prior years? Did we refund the bond, or what happened that brought it to our attention?
Well, Dennis's team is actually the one that found it. We think we were recording it, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but we were recording it, but what was discovered is that it wasn't recorded properly on our CAFR last year, so that's one of those that's hard for us, because in my opinion, the auditor should have known how to record that in our CAFR last year, but it's a difference in how they put that in, the previous auditor put it in.
And I guess my question then, since we just are issuing the remainder of our bonds and we just approved it at the last meeting, is that not something that needs to be brought to our attention when our financial consultant and our bond issuer is doing it? I don't know what happened exactly 9 years ago, because that was a little bit before me. I understand.
Yeah, we think it was just how it was recorded in the CAFR. We've been paying on that bond, we've been doing that part properly. It really just came down to, correct me if I'm wrong, is an issue is how it was recorded in our CAFR.
Right, you moved it over and it should have been held in an asset account, right? As far as the cash that was going in to pay that down, instead of you recorded it as a payment happening.
Yes.
Okay.
So we on our side, we thought we were doing what we should have been doing correctly. It was just pointed out that it should have been recorded differently on the CAFR.
So I guess my question lies in, how do we make sure that doesn't happen again?
So as Dennis pointed out, we have a meeting tomorrow where we're going to be going through what were the findings that we had, what are the things that we need to be making sure that we're watching for, and making sure that we're recording them correctly. That's something that I don't think has happened in the past. So that is one of the things tomorrow. We'll be spending quite a bit of time going over each thing, and there's some things that we know that we need to, that they've pointed out that we need to record differently in our GL. So we'll be going over those steps, and then additionally, what can we do? The asset finding, I don't want that one again. And so we'll be going over what do we need to do to make sure, we put some steps in place already, but what do we need to do to make sure we've captured those things and don't have those problems in the future?
Right, okay, I appreciate that.
Yep.
I have some thoughts and some statements about kind of the trust that you touched on, and I don't know, Shannon, if I should bring it up during your presentation and later, I might do that. He did mention something that I want you to think about, because I've asked and hadn't gotten an answer on, when he talked about that money that was consolidated into our health benefits account, the sale of an old building, and thought it was Scottsdale High back in the day, and then I was told it wasn't, it was previous medical money, so I kind of want to touch on that at some point.
There's two parts on that. We didn't originally have medical in the trust. We had that as a separate bank account with Wells Fargo. That's where a bulk of that money is from. Okay. I do not believe that money was from the sale. I do truly believe that money, we take out every single, well, at that time we were doing it every single pay, but we were taking out from the budget to pay those medical expenses. And so I do believe that is truly from medical. Okay. There was some question as to, there's a workman comp and the liability. Mm-hmm. And so there was 2 investment accounts that had been set up previously to that. We brought in Doug Virgil after he had left us. We brought him back in to do some investigating into those bank accounts again. There is a little bit on that part of it as to how those accounts were set up many years ago, and so how those accounts were exactly set up when where. There is a little bit of gray area as onto those 2 accounts. They were condensed into when we did the new trust. We pulled them out. We had a separate investment firm that was doing part of it, as well as Wells Fargo. And so when we created the new trust, those were closed so that we had it all one and better documented as to what each bank account is. Each bank account is identified separately as medical versus property versus
Right.
workman's comp.
So I think, and I don't mean to do it in this presentation necessarily, but you touched on it here, and it's going to be touched on again when you talk about it later. It's really, it's important for our newer board members to understand the history as it relates to these accounts, because our community keeps bringing it up as well. So there is this conversation out there that we have some rainy day fund or some extra cash sitting around that's like $40 million, and that's not true. There is our trust account, and there are 3 components to our trust account, which is our property and liability, our workers' comp, and our health benefits. And the property and liability has about 9.3 in it, but it has an annual premium of 1.9 million. We have our workers' comp, which has about 6.6 in it, and it has a premium of about $1 million. And then we have the medical account that you were talking about that has about 32 million in it, and it has a premium of about $17 million. So speaking with Shannon, and she was very helpful, you know, you have to keep a certain amount on hand for those premiums. So I just wanted to clear that up, because we don't want people thinking that that is just cash that's sitting there that we can be used for anything. It has to be specifically used to offset expenses or that are identified by Shannon that are like to like you are paying down the increase in our medical premiums with the one account. So that's for that later discussion, but I brought it up, so I kind of wanted to touch on it. Thank you.
Okay, yes, I'll make sure on the budget when we talk about that a little more.
Vice President Sinowski, and then Board Member Hartwells.
Thank you. I just wanted you to know that I was satisfied. I did issue questions beforehand, and I was satisfied with the responses. I want to make sure that we, as a school district, that we are very clearly correcting any issues that we have, and we're not just passing it on to the next year. That was a concern of mine of, you know, are we doing what is right, what is expected, and correcting those deficiencies, whether they were uncorrected misstatements or they were corrected misstatements, that we are learning from that process moving forward. So thank you.
Yep.
And I will say, I mean, we're correcting those. On the questionnaire, there are some of those that we every year will pound. If Dennis came to me and said, I found absolutely nothing, I would go back to him and say, then you didn't search good enough, because, I mean, we do know, we definitely are, those big corrections, we are definitely moving forward with, but we also know that we have humans, and humans sometimes miss things. So definitely we are moving forward with correcting those and getting those fixed.
Good, and hopefully we don't miss money.
No.
Board Member Hartwells.
Yes, I guess this is related to what has already been said, but I'd like to understand these uncorrected misstatements. You had, to make sure I understood how you advised the district to proceed. One, I'd like to understand what the dollar amount, what are we talking about? And then 2, is the advice, as I understood it, that these are curable. However, you'd advise that because of the negligible impact in a go-forward basis, it's not worth the effort to go back and fix these. There's bigger fish to fry as we move forward. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
let me address it, because the two items are two very different.
Yeah.
So the capital lease one, it's about $700,000.
Okay.
And it's not that it's not in the financial statements, but as I mentioned, from an accounting standpoint, it should be reported as a liability, and then you should basically reduce that liability over a 5-year period. But just the nature of copiers, that lease sometimes doesn't even go the 5 years. It goes 2 years, and then you trade them in and get new copiers, and it's actually an accounting nightmare if you actually book it as a liability. And so, we were okay with not recording it as a liability. One, because it doesn't have a material effect on the financial statements. Okay. But number 2, just really the nature of copiers and the fact that, they never go 5 years. They're always traded in, and it just creates that accounting nightmare. So it actually creates more work on the back end, putting it in as a liability. And so it just got expensed in 1 year versus 5 years is ultimately the difference.
Okay. Okay, so in your professional opinion, this is, it's fine to leave as is?
Correct. Yes.
value.
Yeah, and that's what I was mentioning earlier, is that sometimes when you have, they're called uncorrected misstatements. Sometimes they're intentional. So this copier one is more of an intentional because it creates more of an accounting nightmare going forward than it's really worth. And then there are ones where the cash piece of it, where the reconciliation is off from the general ledger, it's $215,000. And so when I say it was uncorrected, it means there was no adjustment made to agree the reconciliation, or agree the general ledger to the reconciliation. So we left a difference there.
Okay.
And that one, Shannon and I have talked about, and that should be corrected going forward. But we didn't want to propose an adjustment and realize that the difference was really due to a timing issue that the district didn't see or that we didn't see. So what I want to talk to Shannon about is, let's look at this difference and follow it for the next several months. And if it stays a difference for the next several months, then it's obviously an adjustment that needs to be made. If it's something that's changing every single month, then it has something to do with timing that does need to be figured out and reconciled.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. One more question. You identified in the questionnaire, the 40 yes/no questionnaires, a couple of what appear to be perhaps some standard operating procedure opportunities to address in terms of payment deposits, but also in the transportation. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Is that standard practice to estimate 2 days a week to extrapolate is that common practice?
It's not. We generally see actual miles being reported, maintained usually on logs electronically or
Okay.
some other means, so that they're reporting actual miles. That's not to say that we haven't seen this before. Even last year in 2019, we did a bigger school district and saw a very similar item.
Okay.
They weren't doing every Tuesday and Thursday, but they only went 25 days, and then they estimated the remaining 100
Extrapolated it
days.
out. Okay.
And so we had a similar recommendation that they were able to correct for this year. So it's definitely a correctable item. And I understand the argument that when you're a big school district, it's hard to track every single day's worth of miles, but it can be done, and other school districts do it.
Great, thank you.
Are there any other board member questions or comments? So just so I'm clear, we operate on an accrual basis, right? Or is that not the same for government?
It's a little bit
accounts?
different. So there's two statements in there. The fund level financial statements, so that's going to be where you see like the general fund, the bond building fund, debt service funds, all the individual funds are reported on what's called a modified accrual basis of accounting.
Okay.
What that means is that long-term assets and liabilities are not included in those funds. Additionally, revenues that are not received within 60 days of year end are not recognized as revenue. Versus the government-wide financial statements, which is basically all of the fund level financial statements combined into a single column like you would see for private sector. Those are on the full accrual. So you've got your long-term assets and liabilities, and the revenues are recorded when they're earned, regardless of when they're received.
I appreciate that. So when we say that the $700,000 photocopier was expensed and not put in as a liability, are we saying that we put in the full $700,000 last year when we approved it, or are we breaking it down on a year-by-year basis?
No, so in the government-wide financial statements, it was recorded as an expense in the government-wide financial statements versus a liability.
The full $700,000?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So then in this year, we wouldn't have that listed. Is that
Correct.
correct? Okay. Thank you for that. Just for the public's sake and knowledge, that it's a legal requirement that we have audits for all school districts, and we actually receive money from the state to do it. I think it's a fantastic law and regulation. I think it's good that we audit our accounts, and I know the board is looking into doing internal auditing as well. But it is just a very good system for all districts and for all government agencies. I believe also, I'm not sure why we switched auditors, but I believe the law that required us to switch every 3 years is gone again. Is that correct? So that's gone. Why did we choose to procure new auditors?
We had reached so the bid that we generally do is 5 years. You can renew it every single year, but it was a 5-year bid. That 5 years was up, so we had hit the point, regardless of the law, we had hit the point where we were going to have to redo that bid anyways, and based off the information provided and costs went into it as well, we looked at what would be, I think it's probably a good idea anyways, just to change up every now and then. When you start the first year with a new audit team, there's a lot more that goes into it because they're looking at a lot more information when you do change that, so.
Yeah, I would just say, whether I'm on this board or not in a few years, that it is a really good idea in practice to try and rotate that just because of the familiarity threats and the issues that you encounter. And I was very surprised when Arizona brought in the 3-year rule very briefly, but brought it in because it's very much a European style of regulation. But I do think it's great, and I'm happy to be working with Clifton Larson, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. And real quickly before you guys finish up, I do want to thank Shannon and her team. This was a very unique year. I mean, a change in auditors on top of the pandemic, and we did a lot of the work remotely, and I think pretty successfully. And we're going to probably continue that going forward, maybe to a lesser extent. We'll be on site more if possible, because it is nice to be on site, but it was very successful. I like doing the remote and actually being on site, because I think that when we were on site, we were able to have probably more meaningful conversations versus just sitting in the conference room. And
We did a lot of Teams meetings on Fridays. So.
That's great. Well, thank you both so much, and we appreciate all your time, as I say, and hopefully it'll be a very fruitful relationship.
Yep.
The board will now move to agenda item 4B, closing the COVID learning gap. Dr. Menzel.
Thank you, President Greenberg. I'd like to invite Dr. Guerin to the podium. As you know, at Scottsdale Unified School District and every public school, we're about teaching and learning. And as we reviewed data after the first quarter to look at where we were with respect to the achievement gap or the COVID gap, learning loss that has been identified as a result of the disruption starting back after spring break last year. We have additional data to report, and I'd like to thank Dr. Guerin and her team for the information that they pulled together for the conversation this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Menzel. President Greenberg, Vice President Sanowski, governing board members, Dr. Menzel, cabinet, and guests. Today, Dr. Bachna and I will present the results of our fall learning assessments and the identification of our areas of focus to help guide our work in closing the COVID learning gap. Though this presentation is focused on student achievement and academics, the impact of COVID and the disruptive nature of the pandemic has had a much broader impact on students. So we understand as a SUSD family that we'll be focusing on not only teaching and learning, but also social and emotional support of students and families. So just want to make that clear that this is not going to be an overnight task. This is going to be a journey or a marathon, much as the pandemic has been. We understand that the learning gaps are not just an SUSD problem, not just an Arizona problem. It is a national problem and clearly a worldwide problem. So we've been doing so much reading and research because we're all facing the same challenges and we want to learn from others. We understand that 55 million students in the United States have had their learning, their normal, disrupted with a loss of in-person learning and just also a loss of instruction. There are students out there that are not engaged in learning at all at this time. We've looked at some research projections, and some researchers have looked at typical summer learning loss or other projected growth assessments, and they're predicting that we could see when students return to more typical learning models, that they could return to us with only 70% of their typical ELA, English Language Arts knowledge, and potentially only 50% of their math knowledge. So we know that we have to be very focused and prescriptive with a sense of urgency, because as Dr. Menzel shared, we have high expectations for our SUSD learners, and we want to meet their individual needs. We are also very concerned about our high school students throughout our nation. Nationally, we're hearing that high school failure rates in some districts are 2 or 3 times the typical rate. that some students are not participating, are not enrolled, or have incompletes. So this paints a picture of what we're facing in the future, but with our talented staff, talented educators, teachers, our dedicated parents and families, we know that we can pull together and with a very focused approach, identify what students need. So this is a spring timeline. This work will continue into the fall. So I want to be clear that this data is a first snapshot of the work we have ahead. We are identifying specific gaps in student learning and then responding, intervening, prescribing, and then progress monitoring to see if it works for individual students. We will have state assessments coming up in our future, and then we really want to optimize summer learning in a new way. We feel that families will want to continue to seek opportunities to engage because there has been such a disruption. So I would like to then turn the presentation over to Dr. Bachna to talk about the specific assessments.
Thank you, Dr. Guerin. So we have a number of elementary and middle school students take a variety of district-administered assessments standardized across our grade levels. In elementary and middle schools, we have SUSD-created benchmarks for English. We have the FastBridge Literacy Screener for early elementary. And in secondary, we have iReady Math Diagnostics for our middle schools. The benchmarks are created in-house by SUSD teachers to follow our district scope and sequence. That's our curriculum progression throughout the semester. They contain a variety of item types and are designed to be challenging, but are not nationally normed or research-based. These tests have detailed heat maps that every teacher can use to review the results with their students. With FastBridge and iReady, we have the ability to compare results nationally and guide teachers to targeted interventions. But these tests are both in their first year of use in SUSD. Finally, with all the data being shared, there are limitations due to validity concerns with many students testing from home. So all the results should be interpreted with caution. So let's look at our elementary benchmark results and talk about what we saw in those. We saw that early elementary students testing at home outperformed those testing in person at school. Across all grade levels and contents, we saw that our disadvantaged students struggled on the assessments. In terms of focus, we saw that the fourth grade English benchmark had substantially more items assessing reading comprehension skills than the third grade benchmark. In third grade math, more word problems and multiplication skills were covered. In both math and English, the higher depth of knowledge questions that required students to choose more than one correct answer proved to be the most difficult for our students. In addition, our teachers are reporting that they are not as far through some of the curriculum as they usually are during a traditional school year, which will impact student performance, especially something like math, where if, for example, a student hasn't been exposed to multiplication in depth before a benchmark assessment, they may struggle more with the test content. In our initial review of the FastBridge data, we saw that between 10 and 15% of our students were identified as high risk, depending on the grade level. A student who is high risk is not likely to close the gap in standard tier 2 interventions. A high-risk student is likely to need interventions that are more focused and offer more time, such as one-to-one. We understand that there is a persistent learning gap related to socioeconomic status, and the pandemic has magnified that gap. This is a high level of concern for us. All of the tools that we use to close the gap are not as available when students are attending school from home. There are a variety of interventions available for students attending in person, including before and after school tutoring, that are not as easily accessible for our students learning remotely. And now I'll turn over to Mrs. Julie Ballard, principal of Tavon, to speak about current data practices at her site.
Thank you, Dr. Bachna, and good evening. In addition to the school city's district benchmark assessments and the FastBridge Universal Screener, several other formative and/or diagnostic assessments are administered at the elementary level. These assessments are used to collect data on what students already know. Diagnostic assessments assess the learner's current knowledge base. The goal is to get a better picture of where students currently stand and then allowing the teacher to make instructional decisions moving forward. They are necessary to look deeper into where individual students are in their learning to to identify possible gaps. An example of a diagnostic assessment is the Fountas and Pinnell assessment. It is an individually administered assessment to identify a child's specific reading level, measuring their word reading or decoding accuracy, fluency, and the child's ability to comprehend the level of text. With the data provided by all these assessments, we can determine what students are able to do and what still needs to be learned, therefore provide the best targeted intervention. At the closing of the Learning Gaps Committee meeting in the elementary breakout, we discussed what is working currently and what are our next steps. Currently, it was shared that the in-person students are making good progress since they've been back in school with strong differentiated Tier 1 and small group instruction, utilizing assessment data to determine necessary instruction. We recommended that interventions moving forward need to continue to be one-on-one and or in small groups, providing targeted, specific instruction based on data. To use research-based interventions with embedded professional development, progress monitoring, and assessments to ensure success of the intervention implemented so that they are fluid and flexible. As for summer interventions, it is recommended to develop a thoughtful, well-planned summer school that incorporated a menu of instructional options to meet the needs of our elementary students, from one-on-one tutoring to small group guided reading or targeted skill groups, to an at-home practice option with a computer-based intervention component. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Bachna to discuss middle school. Thank you.
Thank you. So with middle schools, we again saw concerns with testing modality. Testing at home and testing in person provide different challenges and comparability. 7th and 8th grade English scores were higher within their respective cohorts in terms of percent proficient. But again, we saw disadvantaged learners continue to struggle across the content areas. iReady results were promising in the national comparison, but overall proficiency is low, and we are looking forward to how the spring results may show growth among our students. Going forward, we saw a need to focus on individual student gaps for focused intervention in both English and math. Our 6th grade English scores were lower, which could be due to more complex item types and content, as well as a reflection of students being behind the curriculum. Now I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Akbari to speak about focused interventions at DCMS on the next slide.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bachner, and good evening. iReady Mathematics is a district-adopted math curriculum that we use as a source of data and to target interventions. 3 times a year, students take a diagnostic test. These tests provide us with data on student levels and expected growth from one diagnostic to the next. The data informs us of the school-wide trends and which students would benefit from individualized interventions. Another piece of the iReady program is a prerequisite skill grouping tool. Teachers assign homework using iReady. It identifies students who may have missing skills needed for the next lesson. Excuse me. As you can see, students are divided into groups based on their preparedness for the next lesson and if they have the prerequisite skills for success. At Desert Canyon Middle School, we invite students in groups C and D to the academic support time to give individual or small group help. Additionally, at DCMS, students are working on lessons automatically assigned to their, automatically assigned to them based on their diagnostic performance. We are seeing positive growth in relationship to the amount of time students spend on the program. I attribute the success that we're having with the program to our teachers who have embraced iReady as a vital resource in their classes. On the next slide, the middle school members of our committee shared their thoughts about closing the COVID gap. I cannot overstate that our teachers are working. They are using the data from iReady and benchmarks to determine school needs. We recommend to continue the math and ELA success classes in addition to targeted interventions before and after school. Summertime is a great time to get caught up. We have used the Math Summer Bridge for 8th and 9th grade students in the past. However, our teachers need the tools to help fill the gaps, and professional development is the key. I'd like to go back to Dr. Bachner to speak about high school.
Thank you. The high school analysis did not focus on assessment data, as our students do not take standardized district assessments in December. Our overall grade distribution, however, showed an increase in the percentage of A's earned during first semester of the current school year compared to the last one. Grade distributions were not substantially different between students electing to attend school in person when schools were open versus those staying in distance learning during the fall semester. While end-of-course assessments do differ throughout SUSD, making some grade comparisons more difficult than others, it is worth noting that the final exam weight during first semester was standardized at 10% for every course. Generally, this percentage can vary by department. In looking at areas of focus, while the percentage of A's were higher this fall, so were the percentage of F's. 9% of grades earned were F's as of last week as compared to 5% during the fall of 2019. Students had the month of January to finish the work to clear their incomplete grades, after which those grades become F's as well if they do not complete the work. Our high schools have detailed lists of all their students with D's, F's, and incompletes by course, and are working to reach out to those students and offer additional assistance. With that, I will turn it back over to Dr. Guerin for final conclusions.
Thank you, Dr. Bachna. Our subgroup in high school talked about a very strategic, thoughtful approach in what is working and what to do next. The afternoon time is being optimized, and we are encouraging students that are attending classes in person to stay in person for intervention if they are able to and if needed, and we are looking at expanding those opportunities. Social emotional support, individual and small group, is also happening in the afternoon. We talked about focusing on bubble students, students that are just a few assignments away from passing and just need some individualized motivation and attention from the teacher and counselor to get those grades up. Diagnostic assessments, depending on the subject area, are so important for students. We understand that these are credit-bearing courses, and we don't want to disrupt graduation and throw students off track. So we want to make sure that we offer summer opportunities for making up incompletes or turning letter grades into a higher grade. So summer bridge and summer school are so very important for high school. We're going to continue our strategic work. Dr. Bachna continues to provide the committee data that we crunch and develop recommendations and bring that committee recommendations back to stakeholders for implementation. When we talk about the mitigation of learning loss, it is critical that we take a targeted approach. We know our Tier 1, which is our first best instruction in the classroom that teachers deliver every day, needs to be focused on essential standards. And we're hearing from researchers that in early grades, we should have a really critical focus on core subjects, that reading, math, and science should be a major focus. We need to front load interventions and have them prepared and ready to go for students. And we need to examine the rate of improvement for each student. If they're not responding to an intervention, we need the ability to change that intervention to something else. This assessment data that is going to drive our decision-making has never been more important for us as we plot our road to recovery for our students. We believe that an approach that we all work hard together, partner with parents, partner with individual classroom teachers to support them, that we will be able to move forward through the recovery phase of this pandemic. And then Dr. Bachna and I are ready for any questions.
Thank you. Do any board members have any questions or comments? Board Member Hartwells?
Yes, thank you for the presentation and the data. And my understanding was the more granular data that we'd received in the first round will be available to the public. Is that correct?
Yes, it's posted already on the website.
Okay, great. So if we talk about that, that's good. So let's talk about that if we can. One thing just from a higher level picture here, I'm not seeing in these numbers this compelling disparity between at home or distance learning versus in person as a consistency. And some of those differences, I would argue, because the data's error are not significant. So, 4% is not probably statistically significant. So I'm not entirely convinced that there's a huge difference there. I think the recommended interventions, a lot of which you recommended here, are consistent with what's being recommended at a national level, but are also things that can be done at home. I don't think we should consider ourselves out of the pandemic cloud yet. So I'm hoping we're thinking about these interventions, whether they start now, which would be great after spring break, whether you add another extended school day period, or making good use of that EDL time that I think is being used, in my opinion, it is being used by my kids at least, now, and using the summer not just as requiring it in person, because I do think there's still going to be families reluctant to do so, and with good reason, and choice is choice, right? Okay, so one question, scheduled tutoring. This is back on slide 14, it's not 14 on your slides tonight, but it's titled Elementary, What's Working and Next Steps. You have these nice 3 columns. He says, scheduled tutoring through Beyond Move and Win Reading. Could you tell us a little bit about who that organization is? Who are these tutors? What is their credentials? One. And then 2, the one question is, who's doing, what rubrics are being used in the recommended interventions? It talks about consistent progress, monitoring, determine effectiveness, monitoring with what? What rubric are we talking about? And by whom? Who's vetting the curriculums to use these programs? One program that keeps coming up is iReady. And my understanding is iReady is not something supported at the district level, but rather by some schools that are using it and showing some success as an intervention tool. That was my understanding in the presentation there. So kind of, I've asked you a lot of questions in one breath here, but if I also could just give us a little bit of color on whether the recommendation is to fund at the district level iReady across the board, because we're in the middle of this budget development. Now's a really good time. Let's talk about that. Okay, so if you could go back to kind of what we're talking about on that slide with your elementary school suggestions.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Dr. Hartwell. I wrote down several of the questions, and then I'll have Dr. Bachna jump in as well. So Dr. Bachna expressed concern with the validity of the data and limitations. This is the first time we've tried to use many of these assessments when students are learning at home. And the providers of the assessments, the nationally normed ones, are also suggesting that we be careful in regards to looking at the data. With our younger learners, we noticed some of the assessment scores are higher for at home than in person. And anecdotally, we understand that our young learners need support, and many times have parents sitting side by side providing that support with very good intentions. We need them to do that. But then also that is, it just brings into question the validity of taking a test and what the student truly knows and is able to do on their own when they're sitting at a desk with one teacher. So there's that. With the older students, that we've been trying to mitigate by having cameras on and using different strategies. The committee has developed recommendations on testing, but students are savvy, and the ability to access resources at home when testing instead of in-person learners also there's some validity and limitations in drawing conclusions for the data. So when we had the principals talk about multiple data points, one of the reasons is that's so critical is this is just one score, one pinpoint, one benchmark. So if they use multiple measures of assessment in painting a picture of a student, it is going to be more valid, and we can be more prescriptive in what we need to do moving forward. So
can I have a follow-up as you pointed
course.
that out? And actually, the slide previous to the one that I was referring to is led with the title, requires a balance of assessments. And my question is, what is that balance? Is that something that's being worked on now? What's the balance of summative versus formative versus your screening?
So
I'm sure that's grade level specific.
absolutely.
Talk
And
a little
so
bit about that.
we have some assessments that are common throughout our district. That is definitely a need for more consistency. We have to balance as a school district site autonomy to meet individual needs We never want to take away the ability for teachers or teams of teachers to create formative assessments that align with their instruction to see how it is working. That is such an important part of teaching. But we also have to balance it with being able to gauge how we're doing as a district and draw conclusions from a state level and nationally. So Dr. Bachna and I are working on moving forward to shore up that consistency, bring more diagnostics to the district, looking at a data dashboard and a reboot of the assessment plan, which will be a journey, but it's very timely. So COVID will push us in ways that could be good for the organization with a sense of urgency, so that's what we'll be doing there. When you talk about what is common, it depends on the grade level and subject area, but FastBridge is new, the K-3 diagnostic screener, and iReady is new. We have it consistent at every middle school, and district is supporting funding in many of those cases. It was just something that is new. So we had a meeting on it today. It is very expensive. So right now we are holding on math at the middle school as district funded because we want to make sure anything that we expand on that we can sustain. The worst thing to do is to just get a new program and then not be able to sustain it and make sure it's the correct fit. So we're going to be very thoughtful and careful in our approaches. Anything else on that? So beyond Move On When Reading,
Yes.
You asked about that. That was, Move On When Reading is a state program, but Margaret Cerna, our executive director of Title I, developed a beyond Move On When Reading pre-COVID, concerned about some of our students in their reading skills and how we can move them forward. So she wanted them to have access to reading specialists, really high-skilled reading teachers, and have it be an appointment, a feel where it's individual or small group, and very prescriptive. Then COVID hit, so she found a way to make it work through a program called RAS Kids, but still with the reading specialist, working electronically or virtually. And she said they did it just like a doctor's office. So I'm going to call you and I'm going to schedule your child's time, appointment time, 3 or 4 different sessions, however many sessions, and schedule it in advance and call with the reminder, and had a really great success rate. Needed to be able to find more teachers. So when you talk about how can we still do things virtually, that's an innovation we absolutely want to continue with and duplicate for students that may be at home.
Okay, I wanted to comment, a couple of comments, and then I'll let my colleagues here also speak. A lot of the literature that I've been reading addresses the learning gap, the slide, through learning acceleration, not deficit, right? I think that attitude in approaching it is important here. And that's how I'm looking at it too. So these are learning acceleration suggestions, many of which we should do. The other thing, and that is, you touched on it, and that is these achievement gaps are oftentimes really opportunity gaps for a lot of our students and families. And I think we have a really great opportunity here. The circumstances were crummy getting here, but we do have an opportunity to address in a more holistic way achievement where achievement isn't assessed by iReady or any, right, program, because it's human. So I'm really supportive of taking a more holistic approach and taking advantage of the fact we are unmoored from the inertia of the status quo right now. Because some of these numbers would suggest we had some things we needed to rethink anyway. So let's take full advantage of that opportunity to reassess, re-engineer, rethink how we approach all levels of our education. Thank you. Thank you for all of your work.
Thank you. Do any other board members have questions or comments? Board Member Beckman?
First question, summer school. We made it free last year. Do we know what we're doing this year?
So Dr. Sakos is a partner in that, and we've been having initial conversations. We want to look at if we can optimize scholarships, opportunities when needed, depending on the CARES Act funding.
So that is correct, Dr. Guerin. In pre-COVID, we always had fee waivers or fee scholarships for students in need in terms of credit recovery for summer school. Last year, we were fortunate enough to offer it free for everybody because the state funded it. We will go back to our pre-COVID plans and continue to offer the fee waivers with the hope that with an upcoming grant, we'll be able to extend even more fee waivers or scholarships for summer school. We recognize that we need to do more than just the credit recovery in some high school, summer school, going to, replace a grade replacement, that we're really going to have to utilize these assessments at all levels and look at some of those tier 2 interventions for all of our students this summer. So we do look at, we are looking at expanding that.
Okay, thank you. And I absolutely agree with Board Member Dr. Hart-Wells about the opportunities to kind of get better at what we do. I want to say, just talk about and say hats off to our educators for this semester. No matter what was thrown at them, they stepped up and did the absolute best of any district out there. But I also want to put this into perspective just because we get in the habit of talking about numbers in this type of discussion and we get away sometimes of realizing that those numbers are students and they're actual kids with very real grades, very real futures, scholarships, hopes, dreams, etc. So when we say 5%, last year that was 338 of our high school students. This year, I just did a quick addition of our high school students plus our SOL students in high school. We had 608 kids fail their classes the first semester. So those are students. I want to make sure we recognize that while I do think it is an opportunity, those are significant children that need some help.
And I just want to make a comment, so thank you for that comment. And please know that Dr. Bachna's experience and commitment goes well beyond looking at the aggregate data, but it also, she drills down for our schools what we call the D and F list by school, student, and subject area. And so the principals get those lists on a quarterly basis, and they're able to look at, okay, Johnny is having difficulty in more than one class. And then we have to go back and look at what we call the IPT process, which is the intervention planning team process, bringing the teachers together to talk about what are those deficits and how are we going to strategically approach supporting Johnny in his studies. So schools have been hard at work engaging in those IPTs. Again, kudos to our teachers and administrators and counselors who are still working with our students. But I know all too well with the 2 students and myself in high school that each student is important.
Thank you for pointing that out, Dr. Sakos, because not only do the students, they all matter, the Fs obviously get brought to our attention immediately, but having 2 high school students myself, I worry just as much with those D and C students, et cetera, because they're moving up to the next level. Whatever it is, they're going from Spanish A to Spanish or Spanish 2. Those fundamentals weren't really there, and yet now they're moving forward and they're expected to track both. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. I think we have a lot of work ahead of us. I think we're identifying areas of growth, and I just don't want to forget, again, they're not just numbers. Thanks.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to mention, we do have Principal Palatucci in our little cloud in case you have anything specific questions of a high school principal. She and her team have been very innovative in finding the students and getting them help.
Vice President Sanowski.
Thank you for the great questions, fellow board members. I really appreciate that. My concerns are not just course recovery. My concerns are pre-K through 12, so that I know teachers regularly meet in their teams and do discuss declines. Maybe it's an A student, now they're a B student. That could be spark some concern for a teaching team. So I do respect that. But I think what we need to really be putting in place is that comprehensive support, whether it's from home or in the community, using our community services better, using our school campuses potentially. So I know there's going to be a lot of planning that needs to be put into place for something like this to actually roll out in less than a few months. So I'm going to urge that let's start rolling it out so that families can plan and staff can plan accordingly as well for those that are interested in earning extra funds over the summer and supporting students along the way. So it's not just the course recovery and it's not just about letter grades, but it's supporting students, whether they're the top student performance-wise according to grades or the bottom student. I know those teaching teams do have information on what kids need, and I really would like to suggest that they are very intentionally included in the conversation about resources that they think work best for kids, and that we support that however we can.
Thank you, Vice President Sanowski. We are already working in subgroups, as we mentioned, and I couldn't agree more with you. We are also trying to optimize the tools and programs we already have, because to go out and get something new and then actually have impact on students takes time.
Right.
So we're talking to each other, pulling the innovations and programs and what's working, something like the Move On When Reading, how can we scale it? All of those conversations are happening. So I believe we really have a great group that's going to tackle this problem, and it's actually we're really enjoying talking about teaching and learning and not about metrics and hand sanitizer. So this is our love. We're here for the students, so we're excited about the work.
Super, thank you.
Do any other board members have questions or comments? Board Member Lindsay?
First off, I want to thank you guys for all of your work. I know I asked a lot of questions coming in, so thank you guys for taking all the time to answer our questions. I really appreciate it. With the validity concerns with the distance kids, is there any plan to get an accurate snapshot of where they are? Or will we not know until they're forced to come in and take the AZM2?
So we are hearing anecdotally that they are coming in with just some skill gaps in regards to, I was just talking to our math instructional coach today. She was very helpful, that you can go through the content online, like in Scottsdale Online, but there are some opportunities to go deep that a student might not take that extra opportunity when they're on a self-paced instruction. So as they move into the next class, we'll have to identify that gap and do a quick fill. What I like about Scottsdale Online, the assessments, the discussion, I was going to say dialogue, I know that's right. The discussion-based assessments have students talk about what they know. So that is a much more explicit way, a valid way to understand. But so it's happening as they're starting to come back, but we are going to have to do it system-wide. So our benchmark assessments should help us with that. But you walk in the door and the teacher has formative assessments that are going to help make the decisions quicker.
Okay. And then it's just my hope with the summer school, with the ESSER 2 funds coming, that should be substantially more than the CARES Act, the first round, that we could be creative with offering it to as many students as possible, and not having to navigate the fee waiver. So I just hope we can open it up and offer it to as many people as possible.
Well, that, I agree, that's something we'll be looking into. And if the governor's budget proposal goes through, he has also identified additional funding to help address the learning loss. And so I think there may be multiple sources of funding to be able to help make that happen.
I would just like to follow up on Board Member Lindsay's comment. I would like us to even consider, again, we have an opportunity to do so, moving the bar out for everybody, moving everybody's goals up and out, not just the ones that you're identified as high risk, right? So thank you.
Do any other board members have questions or comments? I have just a few. First, thank you for the presentation, and I agree with many of the questions and comments made by my fellow board members. As was alluded to in one series of questions, and for the public's knowledge, there is a more fleshed out version of the PowerPoint we were just presented. It is published online and it is accessible to you with more data and information. This is an abbreviated version since we've already had the opportunity to review that and ask questions beforehand. To some of the comments here, I know the previous board, and I hope the new board members have had or will have the opportunity to read Mark Tucker's Leading High-Performing School Systems. I forget the Leading High-Performing School Systems, that's it? It's been a long day. And there is a lot in there that I believe we will be taking into account in our strategic plan, hopefully, that is very applicable to this. And one of the things that I think of when I saw this presentation, and I do feel it is a gap and something we should be thinking about moving forward, is in our presentations when we review data of this nature and we want to address these things, to define them first and foremost. What is a learning loss? What is a learning gap? Because I don't think they're the same thing. And I think we all recognize that, but without that definition there in the presentation or given to us, I think we lose a little focus there. And it's something that we should think about in all the presentations that are given and everything that we do to focus on students is to address the very foundational concepts, because to the comment about pushing all of our students forward, if, as an example, in the Leading High-Performing School Systems, we established a set metric of by grade 10, all students have to have accomplished this and be performing at that, well, then the learning gap is the difference between that and where the student is. And the learning loss is just general loss, almost backtracking in their knowledge, what they've been taught, what we think they know, and what they've reverted on. And that's an important difference, because when we're looking at this data and comparing the scores, even if they aren't necessarily reliable because we have certain issues or concerns, we're talking about, again, two very different things, where we want the students to be versus what they might have lost because of COVID. So I think it's very important when we look at these things to be very clear about what our foundation is and what we are working on. And then also, what data do we have, what data do we need, and how we address that. I think those are important topics in all of our conversations about, how we can improve things. Because again, it's not just about data points on specific exams, but even if it is, it's very much okay to come, I feel, to this board or to anyone and say, look, this is what we want to achieve. Unfortunately, we didn't have the data that we needed to get this, and so this is something we're going to learn from and shore up in the future. And I think that's a really important takeaway. And I appreciate going over what we are doing and what is working and what isn't. Obviously, this is a very concerning thing for a lot of parents. I will just share, just to put it out there, that in a non-COVID year, when I was in 7th grade, I got the 2 lowest grades on my math. I was the second lowest grades on my math final. I got a D and an F. And the fact is that we all have those moments for all sorts of reasons. In my case, it was laziness. I was in middle school. But we all have those setbacks. And obviously, our students are dealing with a lot of them right now because of COVID that are entirely outside their control. I am very confident in this district, in our staff, and in our students and our families, that our students will make it back. They will be on track to graduate, go into vocational schools, go to vocational work, whatever it is that they wish to do, that we will get them back there. It's going to take time, but I don't want people to think that there's no hope because of this past year. There is absolutely hope. There is light at the end of the tunnel. Your children, our staff, we will be fine. We are going to get there. Are there any further comments or questions? Very well, thank you so much, and we appreciate all the work that your team has done. The board will now move on to agenda item 4C, fiscal year 2021-2022 second review of budget projections. Dr. Menzel.
As you know, our budgeting process is iterative in nature. So you had a preliminary presentation last month. We did have an opportunity for soliciting feedback from the community on the preliminary budget proposal. Some additional information's been made available, and we've been able to incorporate some of the feedback. And so I'd like to turn it over to Shannon to present that information.
Thank you. Board President Greenberg, members of the board, Dr. Menzel. This is just looking a little bit more at our budget for next year with some additional information, which has all been positive, so that part is good. On this first slide, we're looking at these are basically the assumptions that were there from the last time. The two things that have really changed from the presentation 2 weeks ago was that at that time, we were estimating the inflation to be at 1%. We had received additional information that the inflation looked like it was going to be more like 1.22%. Hasn't been decided yet. We know that the governor's office is saying 1.23. The JBLC is saying 1.22. So we kind of went with the more conservative estimate of what that was going to look like. In addition, we're receiving an additional $32.82 per student to the base level. That comes from last year as part of the final year of the 20 by 20 proposal from the governor's office. There was a $50 million portion of that ended up going to the Classroom Site Fund. That was how it was set up when the agreement was made. Those dollars went to the Classroom Site Fund. It was roughly $40 per student, knowing that this year it would come back into our base level support so that if you leave it in Classroom Site Fund, it doesn't really help the M&O portion of it. To get it into the base level means it helps us every single year going forward with that. So that one-time money from last year was put into Classroom Site Fund. It is coming back over to the base level, which helps our M&O out. So that was a huge help as well. How they came up with the $32.82, that's the estimate from the JBLC. They had $50 million that was part of it, so I suppose they looked at what the numbers were with students, and that's how they came up with the $32, but that's what they're estimating that be. So those two things made a huge difference for us. Other than that, state retirement still saying what we thought it was going to be, and the state so far is looking like it's still going to fully restore district additional assistance. So for us, making those two changes meant that we got to add another $43 to the base level support, which is huge. That brings up, so as you do that, there's a formula that goes all through here as you times the weighted count and the teacher experience. But the bottom line is that puts in over $1.2 million onto our revenue control limit. Huge help. Because our revenue control limit goes up, that also helps our M&O override. So we were able to bump that up a little bit more. When you factor all that in, that essentially brought us to an additional $1.4 million over what we thought 2 weeks ago. The one thing I will say is that this is a process. It's a long process. We do a lot of estimates right now. Really, nothing is final until the legislature votes on the bill for what they want for funding and the governor signs it. Last year we were lucky. That happened early, but that only happened early because COVID hit and the legislature wanted to get things done and closed out. So generally it happens late spring, but like I said, we go off of estimates based off of what we've been told from what the governor's office has put out. We have different groups that look at those estimates. So that's where we're at this point. So with that brings us to, if we look at what our adopted, where we started out, where we thought we were going to be at the beginning of this year, and comparing that to where we think we'll be at next year, that leaves us with a $2.6 million deficit. Before, we thought that was going to be $4 million. So again, we're moving in the right direction here. With that, what can we do? So we've talked about last time moving $2 million from M&O of salaries and benefits over to cash accounts. Again, we feel that we have some cash accounts with healthy balances that we can push those things to. It is a balancing act that we try to do. Yes, those accounts have really high balances. If I pushed $5 million over to get that balance down to where we want it to be for our mid-max, that would be great for next year. But then the following year, I'd be moving $5 million out of cash accounts and back to M&O. So what we're trying to do is do it a slow approach so we can extend that out a little bit farther before we have to look at moving back. And maybe we get lucky and revenues come up and we don't even have to move them back. But if we do it slowly, we can extend that out a little bit farther for us. On the property and casualty payment to self-insurance trust, what that's about is the district budgets those funds and moves it to our self-insurance trust. So by doing that, we're not going to pay an insurance bill. We're not going to, cut benefits in any shape or form. It's just that we, instead of reimbursing what we normally do to the self-insurance trust, we cut that reimbursement back. So it's not in any way, shape, or form limiting any kind of benefits. It's not limiting our insurance premiums that we have. It's just about whether or not we reimburse the full amount back to the trust. Contracted custodial, we had that higher, and the reason for that is that in the past, it's been a much higher increase. When we re-looked at the agreement for next year and what that increase should be, it really should be a smaller percentage. So we were able to lower that down considerably to about $65,000, which is good because we found some other expenses we needed to include in there. The auditor intergovernmental agreement, we know that we're wanting to work on a process with the city of Scottsdale, hopefully to have them do some work for us, some additional audit stuff that is more specialized versus the large district-wide audit. I didn't originally include that because we did originally have a position that was coded for an audit, but part of it was funded in a place that wouldn't be appropriate. In addition, it's a little bit more than what we didn't have a number, so it was a little bit more than what I was really thinking it would be. But so we've included that in there now. Program increases, we've left that alone. And then classified position reclassification. We have some two groups of classified employees that one, we're having a very difficult time filling those positions. They're a very important position. And two, what they do, because of minimum wage going up and up and up every single year, we've gotten it compressed to where they're almost at the minimum wage level, which makes it even more difficult to fill those positions. And so the proposal is to reclassify two groups at about $1 more an hour, which would be more in line with our neighboring districts. And HR did do a study with other districts to see for those positions, what are we paying versus what they are paying, and really found that it would be about $1 more per hour. The other big change is because we were able to receive some additional dollars and where we thought we were going to have to make cuts and what that was about, we realized that we could do a little bit more when it came to raises. And like I said, that really did come from we were able to bump up the revenue control limit quite a bit. So prior to that happening, we were recommending a 1% across the board salary increase. What we are thinking now we can do is 2% for certified and classified, 1.5% for principals and assistant principals, and then 1% for the district level admin. Thought process being that this has been an incredibly difficult year for all of our staff, but more so for staff that are out there on the front line. And so trying to do whatever we could possibly do to make sure that we are taking care of our staff and letting them know. I know it's not the 5% that we've seen in the past, but it's more than what we originally thought, and just trying to really show that we do value our employees. We did have 3 different forums out there for community feedback, and we did try to put in all of that feedback into our thought process. There was a virtual town hall meeting on January 21st. We had 11 participants, mainly employees, but that's okay because we got a lot of feedback from employees through different groups, and their feedback is important to us as well as community members. The main feedback that we got was not to cut special programs, and which we heard on different forums, and to look at vacant positions. It was really about don't RIF people, look at how we can make those cuts through those vacant positions that maybe aren't necessary, which was pretty much the plan in the first place, was to make sure that if we did make cuts, it would be through attrition. Let's Talk, we had a few comments on that. We're still getting some comments on there, but Let's Talk had three comments. And again, it really focused on the need for increases for salary for our certified and classified employees. And then again, not cutting special programs. So we definitely got the feedback on don't touch the special programs. And then finally, we had a thought exchange. With that, I basically left the question, as I did for the board, as to we need to make cuts. These are some ideas. Please let us know what your thoughts are, or rank what's the most important to you. We had 172 participants, 158 thoughts, and 7,638 ratings. Considering this is the first time we've ever done that for finance, I was pretty impressed with the feedback that we got. We did also find out that 52% of those respondents were our staff members. Parents made up the next biggest portion at 36%, and then community members. I did think it was pretty cool. We had 2 SUSD students, and I love the fact that we had a couple students who went in, and because it does impact them, it impacts their classroom. So to whoever those 2 students were, thank you for taking an interest in the budget process. Some key themes that came out of that, and again, things that we tried to look at when deciding, okay, where can we make some cuts? Big thing being reduce through attrition and consolidate district admin and classified positions. So we are working on that portion of it. Pay raises for teachers and support staff. I'm glad to say that we were able to bump that from 1% to 2%. Importance of campus level support and financial focus, really meaning whatever cuts you have to do, leave the campuses out of it, try to make it at the district level first, and where are some ways we're looking at doing that. This one kind of surprised me, continued use of virtual meetings and teleworking. That was actually one of the top 3 themes, was the idea about teleworking and virtual meetings, and looking at ways that could potentially save for the district. So that was not one I was anticipating, but that was one of the top themes. And then again, not eliminating specialty programs. So when we're looking at those proposed budget reductions, like I said, moving the salary and benefits from M&O to cash accounts, withholding the property and casualty payment to the self-insurance trust, and then elimination of vacant positions that are not necessary. We went through as a cabinet and took a look at all of the vacant positions that were out there. Some of them are vacant because we know we need to fill them. They just became vacant. Some of them have been vacant for quite some time, and so we really took a dive into that. Met with different people. I know HR met extensively with transportation. We found a lot of positions within transportation that had just been sitting vacant that aren't necessary. So we took a deep dive into those and are costing out the savings on that. With the self-insurance trust, and I know Board Member Beckman had brought this up earlier, there is a very healthy balance in that account. One of the things we have to be careful about is there are only certain expenditures that we can take from the self-insurance. So I can't take a teacher's position and move it over to the self-insurance trust fund. That's not an allowable expense. There are things that I can do, like not paying the property casualty expense to the self-insurance, which helps us save money there. However, we have to be careful, and I think people look at it and say, that's a huge balance, why do you need that much money in there? And it is a good balance, and that's why we're making some suggestions on things that we can do, but we also have to be careful in that we're self-insured. So whereas we have stop-loss insurance for the district, if we had multiple very large claims, which is easy to do, especially right now with COVID, if we had a few really large claims, you could take that $49 million balance and bring it down considerably in a year or 2 time frame. I hesitate to say it, but I guess we've been good lately. We've been lucky lately, and that's a good thing. But what I would hate to do is to start significantly depleting that account and then get into a situation where we don't have the funds to be able to be self-insured or to cover a large claim that comes in. And again, I know that's a really healthy balance. There's some things that we can do. There's some investment things that we did purposely to help offset M&O costs down the road. And so that's why we're able to come back and say, well, let's Maybe we don't pay the property insurance claim. Maybe instead of, and this, again, does not change anybody's benefits, but maybe we don't fund as much from M&O to the self-insurance trust for health insurance. Doesn't change anybody's benefits. It's just we're not funding it as much as, we're essentially not reimbursing it for the full amount. We can do those in small little things when we need to make, look at the budget. But like I said, we do have to be very careful that we don't completely deplete that account, because then we could be in a serious issue down the road. We are not looking at cutting anybody's benefits. I know it came up earlier that we have not shifted costs for benefits, even though those health insurance goes up every year. The district has been absorbing those. The self-insurance trust has absorbed those. We're not looking at passing that to employees, not this year. We might have to down the road, but that's not what we need to do for next year. We can cover those things for next year's budget. And we don't have the estimates yet for what that will be for next year, but we just feel that we have the balance to be able to do that and not pass that on to our employees for next year. And then the other portion of that is that when we're getting rid of these vacant positions or looking at certified, we're not talking about increasing class size ratios. We're not talking about changing those ratios. It's literally, when we look at those positions, it's about a position that's not needed because because enrollment has gone down. As enrollment goes down, we can keep the class size ratios the same as they've been, but also look at eliminating certain positions just because, one, they're not filled, and two, they're not necessary because we have lost that enrollment. So again, not changing class size ratios. So that's the M&O budget. With the district additional assistance estimated budget for next year, that is based, so M&O is based off of current year funding, which makes it really difficult because I don't know how many kids we're going to have next year. But DAW is based off of prior year ADM. And so when we looked at this originally, we used the numbers that we had back at the 40th day. And when I looked last weekend, I realized our ADM has gone up about 300 for this year, which is awesome. That helps us out with this year budget, but it also impacts next year's district additional assistance. So for that, we were able to pick up an additional $186,000 into that account. So that helps us out. We're meeting right now with different departments, looking at what are their needs, and then what, when it comes to capital, and then what is their wish list, and prioritizing that wish list to see what things can we do. Is it that we need to, I know we were just talking about iReady. Is that something we need to be looking at? Or are there other capital needs that we need to be focusing on? But we do have additional funds coming in there, so we can start to look more at those, okay, beyond what is the gotta have, what would be nice to have, and prioritizing those items. So from here on out, the next steps, on February 16th, we'll be coming back with the proposed salary schedules, which will have the increases that we talked about earlier in it, as well as employee benefit package, what that looks like for each of our employee groups. And then on March 2nd, a tentative approval of the M&O budget, realizing that things can change, but to be able to move forward and issue those contracts, we need to know that we're on the path and moving forward in the direction that the board wants us to go. We'll approve those salary schedules and employee benefits, authorization to issue contracts to certified employees. And then on April 20th, we'll look at the capital budgets and a tentative approval for those to move forward. And then proposed budget on the 8th of June, and the public hearing and adoption on June 22nd. So with that, are there any questions?
Thank you very much. Are there any board member questions or comments? Board Member Beckman.
Quick ones. First, I want to acknowledge and thank you, Shannon. I mean, you are incredibly responsive to our questions, so I think it shows how responsive you are when we don't have a ton. So, and for you to step up this year into this role in the middle of this, you've done a fantastic job, so thank you. Regarding the $2 million that you're moving to cash accounts, you may have mentioned this. What cash accounts are you moving that to?
We looked at indirect costs, MIPS, and then rentals. Okay, MIPS being the Medicaid reimbursement.
Okay, and last question. The offset that we are not we're withholding the property and casualty payment to the self-insurance trust. You have 1.2 million. I have the premium at 1.9. Is there a reason?
Yeah, so we have kept it, the premium is higher. We just haven't been funding it the full premium amount from M&O the past few years.
Okay.
That's just, it's been purposeful that we've been doing it. I will say, we generally pay that at the end of the year. It's almost like a prepay that we do. So if we get to the end of next year and realize, okay, we're doing okay, maybe ADM looks better, then we can go ahead and do that payment, because it doesn't happen until the end of the school year. But right now, we won't budget for it when we're starting out. If ADM looks better and things are, looking great, then we can definitely put that back in, but we haven't taken out of the budget.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Board Member Hartwells.
I just wanted to say thank you. I went into a budget rabbit hole on Sunday, and you were very, very kind in getting back to me. So thank you, Shannon.
You're welcome. There's a lot to school finance in Arizona, and a lot of funds that a lot of other states don't have, so.
Are there any other additional questions or comments? Shannon, on slide 6 for the maintenance and operations estimated budget, the balance from the deficit, is it my understanding that that's 2.6 million that we still need to figure out a way to cover?
Yes, and we are almost there looking at positions. I was looking at it this afternoon. We've got some positions that we have targeted as vacant positions that we know. At this point, I'm about $300,000 shy of making that, and we're still looking at things. So we're pretty close to that 2.6.
For the increases, the 2%, 1.5%, and 1%, is that a sustainable increase that we have budgeted for the future years? In other words, I'm not asking whether we're going to continue increasing at 2%, but whether that 2%, 1.5%, and 1% that we give out based on this next year, we will have that funding. Well, that will never go back down where we would have to reclaim that funding.
The only way that would go back down is if the state, I don't know, like a few years ago when we were in the recession, the state cut back what our base level support. If the state did that, yes, we would be in a problem. The nice thing, and the part that's nice about this $32 that they're moving back into the base level is that stays there, and you grow on that every single year. So yes, that is a sustainable, unless the state comes back and says, we're in a recession, we're going to cut your base level support, then yes.
Thank you. I do know, and it might have been Board Member Hartwell's, but could have been another board member who commented on the addition of the auditor IGA cost. We have spent significant time, but we've not been able to report back because this was actually done in November and December with Allison last year. But in costing out the expenses of hiring a single chief auditing executive, that would probably be about $94,000 to $120,000 for one individual. So while that might be something that happens down the road, it is hoped that the IGA, once it is finalized and it comes to us for review and discussion, that the IGA itself at least gets us off the ground. It gives us access to a team that is very well trained in this area. And that cost is based on all the research I've done on the area for chief audit executives, very low to have that type of access to a team like theirs. Board Member Hartwells.
So would that be for the school year then? That IGA, intergovernmental agreement, would be with the city of Scottsdale for 1 year?
So what we're looking at is a draft of the IGA. I've actually got a meeting tomorrow morning with Sharon Walker. We're looking at a 3-year agreement. There's an exit clause if it didn't work for us or for them, but we're looking at 3 years at the initial juncture and looking at a scope of work that's narrow to start with that we can then expand on based on that first audit that's done, so that we can both kind of feel out how well it's working. Does it work for them? Does it work for us? And we can build from there.
When can we expect to see a draft proposal brought to the board?
Our goal was to be able to have it so that we can approve it, both the city and Scottsdale Unified in March. So I'm hoping that we'll have a draft mid-February, as long as tomorrow's meeting goes well.
Board Member Hartwells.
I guess since we haven't seen the draft, but maybe you already know the the payments under which, would it be project-specific, or would it be a lump sum and on retainer type of?
Well, it's based on, so the way the IGA is drafted at the present time, it's based on looking at one discrete project, and then the payment structure is, I think it's on a monthly basis. I'll have to go back and confirm.
Yeah, so it is something that we will be bringing forward, hopefully relatively soon. There might need to be certain accompanying changes to policies as well, but insofar as this $100,000 cost is concerned, that is why it's listed there, because it is higher. I believe the position we had listed was about 70,000.
It was a little bit higher than that, but it was split funded. So the position originally was part audit, internal auditor, part budget or bond review. And so it was split funded between actually indirect costs and bond. It's been sitting vacant. We created it. Somebody was in it for maybe a month.
Yeah.
And then it's been sitting vacant since then.
So
So it's actually a position that I'm looking at saying, okay, if we take that out of indirect cost, I can move somebody else into indirect cost and a little bit of savings for our M&O for next year.
is there any further debate? Thank you very much,
Yep.
Shannon. The board will now move to agenda item 4D, board meeting structure. Dr. Menzel?
Thank you, President Greenberg. This is really good timing for us to have a conversation about board meeting structure now that we're 2 hours into this meeting. I was going to say halfway through, but I didn't want to jinx it. So as you know, at our board orientation and at other board meetings, we've had discussion about how can we improve the effectiveness and efficiency of our board governance process. And so there were a number of things that surfaced in the conversation, and that included considering the start time, potential for adding dedicated study session each month, dates of the meetings. As some people know, one of our meetings conflicts with the City of Scottsdale council meetings. And then the current practice that we have in place for multiple periods of public comment, where some of the items, this was not intended to be an inclusive list, it was just intended to be a start of the conversation. And really, it's an open forum to get a sense of what you're thinking and how we might be able to improve the structure of our governing board meetings in a way that helps us do the business that we have to attend to, but do it in a way that also doesn't last late into the night.
Thank you, Dr. Menzel. So I think the best method forward is, I know different people have brought up different items, and I think if we just treat each item on its own as presented in the agenda, we can start with the individual who requested it and then go from there. So the first point, I think, would be the time of our board meetings. Just a couple years ago, they started at 3 and one started at 5. Our regular meetings start at 5. Our special meetings start at 3, and thanks to President Beckman at the time, we were able to change that to 5, given that we have working schedules. But Board Member Lindsay had some additional potential recommendations, so I will turn it over to Board Member Lindsay on that point.
So I'll just start with, my daughter's in 4th grade, so 5 years into the district, and have been trying to be very active since she got into kindergarten, and trying to be involved in the district has always been a challenge for a working parent to come to the meetings by 3 or 5. And I hear that from a lot of elementary parents, that they would like to participate in the process, but between getting their kids, helping with homework, getting off work, they can't tune in at 5. They can't make it at 5 o'clock. So the analyst in me went back and looked at 15 of our peer districts in the valley. Nobody starts at 5 o'clock. Out of those 15, 6 start at 6 p.m., 3 start at 6:30, and 6 start at 7. So then I said, okay, well, let me look outside of this area, and I looked at Washtenaw, where Dr. Menzel came from, and the 9 districts there, nobody starts at 5. The 2 start at 6, 3 start at 6:30, 4 start at 7. So it just seems like 5 is a struggle for people. Maybe 6 would be a concession, allow people an extra hour to get home. I know previously in the district, our meetings used to start at 7 a long time ago. And then board dynamics changed and they started moving it to earlier and earlier and earlier. So that's just what I was looking at. I just think 6 would probably be a little bit more flexible for people. and allow more people the opportunity to participate.
Do any board members have comments about this? Vice President Sanowski and then Board Member Beckman.
I think Board Member Bickman had a
Oh,
hand up.
apologies.
It doesn't-
Board Member Beckman, I
I'm always
apologize.
Talking, you can go.
I would like for those that we actually, like why we're here, we are here to educate kids. And those kids have parents or guardians attached to them, and I would like to encourage them to be included in this process. And I do think having it during, 5 o'clock start time it makes it challenging, even more so than saying, I'm going to leave my house in the evening, be committed, sometimes just sitting and observing, if not providing public comment. I think changing the start time to later in the evening makes sense to help families better participate in this governance process.
Board Member Beckman.
Okay, I don't disagree, but I'm wondering, just for this discussion purposes, if we are putting the cart before the horse a little bit. To be honest with you, I absolutely agree from the parental perspective, but I have to keep in mind our staff and our teachers, et cetera, and our principals that get to their schools at like 7 a.m., that don't even live in the district, that come and sit here and sit through a 4-hour board meeting and drive very far. I can even think of Dennis, who lives very far away, and then they're back early in the morning. So my question to all of you is, could we not consider working on the efficiencies of our meeting and get them to below 4 hours on average, and then consider this? And because I would like to see us maybe become more efficient, so these meetings take like maybe 2 hours, so that we're not looking at 10, 11 o'clock at night before potentially we get out of here for some of our staff. Just a consideration. I do agree about the parental perspective, that getting home, dinner, the whole thing, it might make it a little bit easier, but I also don't want to really have our staff driving home and getting to bed at midnight, turning around and coming back at 6 a.m.
Do any other board members have comments on this? Board Member Hartwells.
I'm all for giving a whirl to the working hypothesis that parents can be more engaged in the governance process if it were at a more family-friendly time. That said, in deference to the balance with, it's a really long day for the staff and all the presenters that tend to, kindly give of their time, can we continue to use the remote participation? Because that certainly is a significant time savings, particularly with respect to commuting. Coupled with, and I think that is part of the conversation here, as my understanding, is efficiencies in how to be more efficient with our time, which I will just say, I think we've been doing a pretty good job personally. Nice job. I think we can continue that. We come up with a plan of attack that takes advantage of Dr. Menzel's kind of subcommittee structure. So I am amenable to however we choose to proceed, but I would ask that we consider keeping the remote connection in for our presenters, and particularly in deference for the reasons that Board Member Beckman raised.
Or maybe we meet in the middle, I don't know, until we get these board meetings like a little bit more condensed.
Do any board members have other comments or questions? Board Member Lindsay.
I think, Dr. Menzel, we had talked, there are ways that we can shorten our meetings. And I think that's a discussion later in this discussion about lowering our meetings potentially. But with the committees, there are things that we can do immediately that should, in theory, lower our meetings.
Yeah, I think that there absolutely are ways to operate more efficiently while still having the kind of dialogue and conversation that's necessary to do the business of the district. And so that's what we don't ever want to compromise on. I do think we can use technology to address some of the staff concerns. I think you also know that sometimes there's nothing like being able to look in your eyes to make sure that the answer that I gave is really responding to the question that was asked, and it doesn't feel quite the same if you're in the cloud than if you're in the room. So I think that there's an opportunity here. I'm actually kind of interested in testing out what is the right start time. Personally, I think 6 is probably all right. For those that would be driving home and participating remotely, that might be enough time to be able to do it. And if our goal is to have meetings done in 2 or 2.5 hours, if we start at 6, we're still done at a reasonable time. But and that's why I worry about a 7 o'clock start time, because then you're 10, or if we had the 4-hour meetings, again, you're 11, it's really late. That's also not family friendly, because kids need to go to bed, they need to, so it's trying to find that right balance between all of those competing demands. And so I think it's a reasonable conversation, and I do think we can get the length of the meetings down. We're going to do our part administratively to continue whittling away at the length of the presentation, getting information to governing board members in advance, and then trying to make sure that we're pushing that information out so the public can see what you see, and we don't have to rehearse it all through every meeting.
Are there any other questions or comments on this?
I mean, I'll just add, what really stuck out is I could not find anybody else who has a 5 o'clock meeting. So every other district seems to make it work. And I would like to think that we could make it work as well, because you don't see the complaints. I mean, PV starts at 7, Mesa 6:30. So a lot of our peer districts are starting at a time that's more, it allows for participation. And that's why I just think 6 is more in the middle.
Vice President Sanowski and then Board Member Beckman.
Let's try it. Let's start at 6.
That's what I was going to say. Can I have an incentive then and a commitment from me that if we can't condense these board meetings, I will be asking for this to be on agenda again before I watch our staff get out of here at midnight. So that's our goal then, is to get to the typical, start at 6, I suppose, and then get to the typical 2-hour meeting to where we are not overworking them.
That's fair, and I don't think this is, if we do make this change, I don't think it's something that's going to change next week. It'd probably be something so that people have time to prepare and reevaluate their schedules. I would personally support it only because when I think about my own day working, in order for me to come here 10 minutes away or 15 minutes away, I do essentially have to stop working at about 4:15, get ready, get everything packed and come over, which is about an hour and a half of my day that would otherwise be spent working on my job. And I think, we have board members with varying needs. I think probably one of the reasons that the change went to 3 in the afternoon is just because the board members at the time that fit their schedule, and I'm sure that probably wouldn't fit almost any of ours now. So I think we can try it out. We'll put it in for a test period at some point, maybe March or April, and see how it goes for a bit.
Sure, 7 a.m. would work great for me too, but
Well, and Dr. Menz and I said, executive sessions could start earlier than 6.
Right.
So then we're starting the meeting at 6 after the executive session.
Right. Very good then. The second point that is mentioned is the additional meeting. Historically, we had a study session where we did not take any action, and then a regular board meeting where we might have the discussion items, but we would also take the consent or action items. We kind of changed that to a special meeting just because of how many things we had to vote to approve to make sure that the administration was receiving the approvals it legally required to continue maintaining our district, which was an important change. But the question has now come up, should we add another meeting? We've had 5 this month in January, which is a lot. But I don't think that's too different from what we've been experiencing for a while now. And so the question is rather than constantly planning new meetings here and there, if we just added a set meeting that would be maybe a study session to focus those discussions, and that might reduce the amount of discussions we have at the other meetings and thereby decrease the time and length of meetings generally. But again, this was brought up by Board Member Lindsay, so I will defer to him.
I'm indifferent to it. It's a model that Gilbert, for example, uses. They do 3 meetings a month. Their regular board meetings, they're set 2 hours, and then their work study is just discussion items. So basically, they're taking all the discussion items off the regular meetings and putting them in one work study meeting. It was just an idea to lower the time, but it requires another meeting. So.
Board Member Hartwells and then Vice President Sinowski.
I have a question to clarify. So the study session would be in addition to the committees?
Well, that's how it is being put on the table, I think, for consideration. And I, from my perspective, I think the committees might accomplish the same purpose in part, but maybe not in whole. And so I'd like to listen to others' thoughts about what would be the specific topic for a study session and the rationale, and how that either aligns or doesn't with the committee structure where we're trying to, keep the work moving in an efficient manner.
So
Continue,
as
please.
a follow-up then to that answer, how would a study session play out in our current context? How would you envision that?
Again, I'm indifferent. I was just looking at brainstorming ideas, and Gilbert, what they do with their study sessions is they take the discussion items. So we had, 4 tonight? They would take those from the regular meetings, and they would put those in a study session meeting. Then you would just do the discussion items. There's no voting on anything.
Okay. And then I guess then the question would be the preparation for those discussion items. Is the staff preparing twice a month for the same presentation? Is that going to be burdensome or no?
So it depends on what happens in the second meeting, right? So if a discussion item ends up on an action item at the second meeting, if there's additional questions or additional presentation expected, then it's, additional work. The way we structure it now, we try to, if something is significant, we want to give it more than one opportunity for board consideration. We want to, and we've been putting as much as we can on the consent agenda to kind of keep things moving, and then focusing on the really substantive issues as specific action items. I mean, I can make an argument both ways, although I do think that the committee structure and the other piece that the district had implemented previously was the 2x2x1. So when you have something that really requires more time and attention, I'm thinking about, the review of the 2016 bond process. We could spend 2.5 hours here just going through all of that detail, which is really long. And so you're asking people to sit through something where we'll go through the presentation a few times, but it gives you the ability to ask those questions and get up to speed. Then what gets presented is really the Cliff Note version. So it's not as though the public still doesn't get to see it, but it's just, it keeps the process moving in a way that maybe is more respectful of time.
And to add to that, our system's in place and it goes with kind of the time change comment that I had just made. The reason why we might not want to, for example, just immediately change the time tomorrow to 6 p.m. is that we are introducing this committee structure and we have the 2x2x1. So in a couple months, once those are up and running, we might find that we don't need a third meeting. And I apologize, I did not mean to imply that Board Member Lindsay had really wanted this. It really was just an idea because it is used by other districts, which I appreciate how other districts use them. But that was just the point there. Board Member Lindsay?
But I'll just add, when I was looking at all the other districts, they all, besides Gilbert, they say schedule study sessions as needed. So I guess, if you have something coming up and there's going to be some that's require a lot of time and questions, then they schedule a study session. But I didn't find any other district that has them regularly scheduled besides Gilbert.
Board Member Beckman?
I feel like we're going to walk out of here and you think I'm just adversarial tonight. We just had a conversation about working parents and accommodation. And so I hate to tell you this and make this about me necessarily, but this is I cannot go to my employer and say once a month, on top of all of our other commitments, I'm taking a half a morning off. If it was something as needed, maybe the flexibility, but, you know, I am a full-time working mom, and as you all know, we have a lot going on as it is, and 3 years into this, asking, and I'm speaking for myself here, I have a very real career, going and saying, sorry, I leave at 7 in the morning, and I'm not going to be back until maybe noon. That's a lot, so I can't.
And I never said the morning.
Yeah, I don't know if we would do it in the morning, because I don't think
That wouldn't work
anyone's.
for me either,
Yeah, that wouldn't
so.
work
Yeah,
for me.
that was just me. I wanted, if we're going to have a study session, let's do it in the morning where people have clear
Right.
heads, they've got a
Right.
full night's worth of rest.
Okay, it was presented to me like it might be a morning one, and so I had to dig in there and say, sorry, can't do that. I would be open to it as needed. Going back to my original statement about board efficiencies, I really would like, you guys, I want to reevaluate what we do and our purpose, and our goal is to not manage this district. We are in a situation right now where COVID is demanding a lot of our time and a lot of things on agenda that are not normally there. And I hope that we can get back to being a board that does not manage things and require so many meetings with so much time and so many detailed presentations, because really that's not what we're supposed to be doing. So I'm not, just giving my opinion there. I would be open to them as needed. I just don't think it's good practice for us to really be meeting about every single thing that goes on. The 2x2s were working well, and that was meant to be kind of that elimination for an additional meeting. And if we were continuing to have 2 regular meetings a month and a study session and 2x2s, I think we're starting to get on a slippery slope a little bit.
Do any other board members have questions, or Vice President Sanowski?
Yes. I see the study session as being an opportunity for us to seek clarification on issues that we are going to be asked to make decisions upon. And so I see it as being like a potential scheduling as governance, study session governance throughout the month, and that we plan very carefully to determine what specific topics need to be included in the study session, so that when we are expected to take action on items and a consent agenda, that we are then not burdened with the information and discussion items times 2, or this past month, 5 times, we have discussion information items. If we did it to just 1, and we could be really careful and deliberate on what we were going to include in that study session, to me, that would serve its purpose. The study session I don't see as being a means to eliminate public input, but for us to have open, according to open meeting laws, open conversations, so we can, aside from shooting emails to people and asking them questions that we're going to be making decisions on, like the budget, for example. I see the budget as being a great study session topic from beginning to end. There's a lot that we need to consider. And instead of pulling it into all these different meetings, to have a focused meeting. So I think throughout the time of a school year, there are specific items that would lend themselves to really being the all-encompassing in that study session, like budget. I'm never a person who thinks that we need to add more meetings to anyone's schedule, but I think if we could go to 3 dedicated and not adding additional ones as needed, because we're going to be able to slot in our work more efficiently, then I would say let's go with the governance study session governance type of a schedule. Last month, we had 5 plus our retreat, so 6 times we met. If we could cut that in half, I think that's a win-win for everyone. And if we just really were diligent and focused, instead of thinking, well, we can just add another meeting. And I do realize that sometimes we do have to meet according to what's going on in our universe. So I would really like for us to stay really focused and having that lead to our effectiveness and efficiency of our meetings. So if it means an additional hard meeting, then in my mind, I support that. I don't love meetings, but I don't know anyone who does, so, but we have work to do, we do the work, right? So, and I think for staff, they go home and work too. I'm very aware that staff doesn't just shut their computers and go home to work. I can't think of very many positions in our district where people actually do that. I'll go along with what, I think it's worth trying to be more effective and efficient. So I'll go along with what the group wants to do, but I can see the value in a study session where we're allowing people who have, invite them in, let's ask them questions if they're experts on the topic we're going to discuss.
Thank you. Board Member Beckman.
I agree, and I think you remember, as short as 2 years ago, that's how it used to be. We would have a study session that would have no action items, no consent agenda, no public comment. It was purely discussion items, first look. You would ask all of your questions, and then the next meeting was a regular meeting where we typically voted on those items, and in between with some questions to staff, et cetera. Obviously, we then developed more questions, et cetera, in between. So we spaced out the meetings from Thursday to Tuesday, what used to be study session to regular meeting, which you remember, to 2 weeks in between, so we could get more questions answered. And that still wasn't enough time, so we started these 2x2 meetings that were the committee meetings, and now it seems like that's still not enough time, so we're talking about maybe yet another meeting that's back to being a dedicated study session, which I agree 100% with the concept of a study session. I just need some clarity on what we can expect going forward from, and that's why I want the discussion. I'm not trying to state the rule here. Are we going to still have these committees? Are we going to, what I don't want to happen is I don't want this dedicated study session that we may add here to then evolve into being yet another meeting, that we take action and et cetera.
Right.
And then we just keep doing that.
Yep.
So
I agree.
eventually
Cycle.
getting back to best practice and being efficient, et cetera, should be the goal. So I guess I need clarity around where we fall with all of those committees and 2x2 meetings, et cetera, because that's a lot. We have committees now, we do 2x2 meetings, we're proposing a study session, and we have 2 regular meetings a month.
Board Member Hartwells.
Can I make a suggestion that maybe we give the committee structure a little time to play out and just see, go back and reassess this in a few months once we see how those committees get off the ground and get rolling? It may supplant the need for a study session. I would prefer that approach because the idea of having 3 set meetings in a month on top of committee meetings, which I fully intend to sink my teeth into, that is a lot. It's a lot to ask. So, and it may be what we need to do, but can we just do this one variable at a time here?
Yes, so if I may make a comment, I think there's quite mixed views on this, so I think we can proceed for the time being and maybe table this discussion for another time, or give us the opportunity to perhaps think of a more concrete example. I think, surprisingly, I'm not sure what the difference is, but I feel that at least in the first month, we've managed to put at least one item of interest to each board member in our meetings. If that isn't true, please do contact me. I have found in regular years that it is extremely difficult to get an item on the agenda at all, and probably because of just time. There's a time limiting factor to a lot of what's discussed, and I know that previous board members had consistently, year on year, brought up topics. Whether I agreed with discussing those topics or not, they clearly wanted to discuss those topics. There was interest in it. And they weren't scheduled, again, I'm pretty sure just because of time. So right now, I think we can move forward with the committee structure, revisit this if necessary, hopefully it's going to work out the way we intend, but I think that's an appropriate way to move forward.
President Greenberg, can I make just one last comment? That is, I think, the best approach, because I think as we move forward with the committee structure and the discussion items about COVID and reopening and et cetera are going to start to be obviously less and less. That's the hope here. I think we may find ourselves less labor intensive as far as the length of these meetings.
Very good. The third item, the City of Scottsdale conflict. We do conflict with the City of Scottsdale's General Council meeting because it is on a Tuesday. Is there a desire, and I believe, again, this was a point raised by Board Member Lindsay, is there a desire to shift that meeting to the Thursday or the Wednesday just so that we can avoid that conflict, especially in our hopes of building a stronger relationship with the City of Scottsdale? And I will pass it over to Board.
And it was, again, just
Board Member Lindsay.
brainstorm.
Right.
But as we say that we want to work on our relationship with the city, it's hard to grow the partnership when we both have our meetings at the same time.
Yeah.
It would be nice, in theory, we could attend their meetings, they could come and attend our meetings, but that's not going to happen when our meetings are going on at the same time. So that was the only idea there.
Board Member Lindsay, I agree.
Right.
Vice President Sinowski.
Yes, actually, they're meeting tonight, and I
Correct.
wanted to be there as well. So I think we end up asking our community to decide where they throw their support, if it's city council or if it's school district. And I hate to think we have to give them, like, make them make a choice. And we do want to be nurturing a relationship, a better relationship with our city. So I would like to see us switch our meeting to Thursday. The day of the week doesn't matter to me, as long as it's not on the same night as the city council.
Agreed.
Board Member Hartwells.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. Let's move.
Okay, we got one.
Well, just for fun, anyone want to guess what time their meeting starts?
Oh, don't, like 7, I think.
6, 5.
So we,
Yeah,
we're-
so if we move ours later, you can go there first and then come here.
Well, they won't be done in an hour.
No, but I will note that that isn't to maintain preference of one city over another, because we do actually have 4 cities in our district. So that's one thing that we will look into, and we can, again, that isn't necessarily a change that's going to take place this month or in the next 2 months just because people have things planned, but we will look at the options there to change that.
And you're only looking at changing one of the meeting nights,
Correct.
not both,
Correct.
correct?
Yeah.
Just making sure.
Item 4, public comments. At our regular board meetings, we are not legally required to have public comments ever, but we choose to do so during our regular meetings. I think that's a great plan. However, Board Member Beckman and I tried to bring the public comments earlier in the meeting. We succeeded in that. However, we also added a bunch more public comments throughout the regular meeting that I think are unnecessary. If we, is there any desire to keep all those additional public comments, or would it be sensible to try and reduce those to just the one at the beginning? Board Member Beckman.
I just think it's good to have a little context of how this happened. We had one public comment years ago, and we received quite a few people showing up for public comment. So, and that was in the beginning of the meeting, and the board at the time, and I am just relaying what I was told by that board at the time, felt that if those people that had showed up for public comment, that many of those comments were about action items that happened later in the meeting, and if maybe they would have stayed and listened to some of the board discussion or the presentations, they would have had their question answered and therefore wouldn't have needed to have public comment. That was the response at the time.
Yeah.
So I tried to take it back to the one public comment, and it was still felt strongly that additional public comment later in the meeting, after the discussion items, before the action items, was needed. So therefore, Dr. Creekard was creative with the 3 before each area on the agenda, which this did allow then our parents that were coming to just make a comment to the board members, and with their children, et cetera, to be able to comment and leave. And that was the concern, was that we had families waiting until the very end of a long meeting to be able to make a comment, and a lot of them couldn't. They would leave before. We had one person walk out and say, well, you won, I can't stay anymore. So then we went to the 3, so that people could just make their comment and leave, and that's where it stayed for a while until now.
Correct, and this would require a policy change, and by our own policies, that would mean that we have to have a first read, and then at another meeting, approve any changes to the agenda set. But Board Member Beckman's entirely correct. I'm very happy that we were able to move it earlier, but we have all these additional ones that, as I'm sure you noticed in our regular meeting, I kept repeating. Nobody has ever made use of them as far as I'm aware, and I don't know if you recall anyone making use of them. So if there's a desire, if there's a desire to keep them, there's no need to potentially bring a policy revision forward. If there is no desire to keep them and we think the one early at the beginning of the meeting is sufficient, then that's what we would work to amend. Are there any additional comments or questions on that? Board Member Hartwells.
Just to clarify, so if folks don't necessarily take advantage of the subsequent on-ramps to comment on the segment of the agenda that's relevant to their comments, is this necessary to make a policy change? And I don't know how I feel about making a change that removes options for the public to comment. So I'll just leave it at that. And while I appreciate that's not the intent, it's a part of the efficiency conversation, and if it's not being used, why leave it there, right? But if it requires a policy lift.
In order to speak at the public comments, you have to fill out the card and give it to Gladys beforehand. So if you're not here in the first place, you wouldn't, if you came in a number of hours late, I mean, I don't know if we have a strict policy on that, but we usually, it doesn't happen. Board Member Beckman.
You might want to ask Ms. McClellan on that. I'm not sure they have to, for those later public comments on the action items, that they have to, I think you can take them. I may be wrong. I think you might be able to take those public comment cards all the way up to action.
President Greenberg, members of the governing board. Your governing board policy is BEDH on this topic, and it appears to me from a quick review that anyone who fills out a comment card could provide their input. So I think that you're correct.
Okay, so that means that they could come in at any time and we would present it. Although, to be clear, the later ones are content restricted to items on the agenda that are being discussed. So they could not, most of our public, in fact, as far as I'm aware, almost all of our public comments are usually about either something very early on or our general comments.
And I would just add BEDB outlines the agenda structure, and that's where it includes the additional public comment times on the agenda.
It's not so much about removing people's opportunity as reverting it to what it was and eliminating something that for, what, 2 years now hasn't been used.
Okay.
Because, I mean, otherwise it's just me asking, there's nothing, and then we continue. But it's a fair point. Board Member Beckman?
The only thing that it does is if we do revert to the one public comment, they need to be there when it's happening per se, unless we are going to, because at the time when we just had the one, we did require all the cards right then, and that was the only public comment. When we changed it, as you know, President Greenberg was saying, then you could come in, I mean, technically, right before the action items and speak right with that last public comment. So if we change it now, it doesn't mean they can't speak on action items. It means that everyone would have to do it in that first public comment. So it doesn't limit public comment, it just makes it earlier in the agenda so they can't speak later.
And before I go to your point, I think it's highly unusual. I don't think any other district does this, but Ms. McClellan, if you could comment on that.
Sure, President Greenberg, members of the governing board. There are the way your policy is listed in BEDB, it allows it has a specific time for public comment, and then you have a statement that says that the members of the public will be able to comment when the agenda item is presented. So I think that that's the compromise that you're talking about with Dr. Creekard, where additional public comment periods were added so that it could be next to the agenda item. I have seen that. Phoenix Elementary School District, for instance, operates that way, but most school districts only have one period of public comment, generally at the beginning of the meeting, for the purpose of allowing the board to hear the public comment before you deliberate, and then the public comment is concluded.
Board Member Hartwells and then Vice President Sinowski.
Well, I'll just add then to lat us back to the opening of this action item, which was the current start time. So if we're going to require that your public comment period is at the opening of the meeting, then maybe we should be a lot more sensitive to when parents can be here at the opening of the meeting. Okay.
Vice President Sinowski.
And speaking of public comment, obviously, there are people who are choosing to not go into public right now because of COVID, and I would really like for us to decide upon how we would pull back in phone comment to our meetings so that viewers from home and also potentially and some of us had shared this as a potential thought too of continuing with email input as well, if it's in advance of the meeting, and then phone comment during the meeting. And we'd obviously have to be looking at the time period of public comment and the allotted amount of time that we were interested in, like setting a limit to potentially, if that was something that we were concerned about. But I do think phone in comment or some type of manner that is communicated and organized for those at home being able to give their input in our meetings.
Okay, so I think it sounds like there's a general view that that it might be sensible to bring forward a policy revision.
Should go to the policy committee.
Yeah, to go to the policy committee. The final item that I am aware of, and of course then we can open it up to anything else, is the inclusion of a certified, classified, and administrative report period, at least each quarter at our meeting, something that's built in where they're invited to come and update us. And I will hand it over to Vice President Sinowski to discuss this further.
Thank you. I do think that in order for us to attract and retain top caliber employees throughout our district, that we need to be paying attention and being able, really welcoming, listening to their input on a regular basis. And we already have a structure in place. We have a certified, a classified, and an administrative association in our district. And those organizations meet regularly with individuals within those employment structures, and they discuss what I used to call as grows and glows. So what's working well and what needs to be improved upon. And I think it's important for us to try to, when we talk about efficiencies of meetings, that is also about efficiency in gathering information. So if those leaders or representatives from those groups are, included, invited into giving, 10-minute report, 5-minute report, whatever they feel they need to do, I would really recommend that. I think that is, again, respecting our employees, and that's how we keep them.
And I believe this would be in line with our student advisory group reports that we receive.
Yes.
So we already have this for students, and we have, through Dr. Menzel and Dr. Creekard, we've developed a full committee that does that, which I think is fantastic, and I hope we'll be able to start receiving those once again. But I think the idea is to branch that out to the other stakeholders that work with the students every day, whether that's driving them to school or teaching them or their principals. Board Member Beckman.
I doubt this would get utilized, but just from a equity standpoint, if we're going to potentially make time, specific time, for those groups in our agenda to discuss issues or items, are we going to allot for equal time for people that are not part of those groups? I mean, I doubt it'll get used, but.
They
if
do in
want-
public comment.
What?
They do in public comment.
But I mean, it's not necessarily dedicated. I'm just throwing it out there. I have no idea. I just want to make sure that we are recognizing, all. And because I agree with you, I think it's great to listen to all of it. I just I don't want to open up a can of worms as far as saying, and do we have to disseminate between public comment and that? Or is there, I guess I'm asking, is there any issue with saying these groups have this allotted time, but others have to use public comment?
So the issue would be from our current policy and practice, public comments limited to 3 minutes. We've not done that with the students, and as you know, when the students come, we also want to have a conversation. So they'll present, then we have an opportunity to engage in a dialogue. So that's what's different from the public comment piece, which is unidirectional, public to the board, you receive it, but we don't engage in a conversation at the board table. With these kinds of reports, you have an opportunity to ask clarifying questions, identify, what else might be useful to know in the future. So when we talk to the Student Advisory Board, new things come up that the board's interested in that can go back to the Student Advisory Board. So that's how I would differentiate between the standard call of the public and what you would be getting from reports like this.
Right.
And that's what I meant. I just wanted to make sure that if somebody didn't want to be limited to 3 minutes and they wanted to talk or say something that was going on in a committee that they were on, whatever it is, not necessarily say, I'm not part of this, so I'm going to give you more like, if I'm on a committee and I want to talk too, but I don't want to have to do it through public comment, how do I do it? That's to me more all-encompassing if we needed to.
Yeah, I would generally, if there's a member, if there's a student group or a staff group that wishes to have a discussion, I would say to bring it to Dr. Menzel and whoever the board president, vice president, whatever that is, to potentially schedule that or find the right way to do it. I think with the Student Advisory Board, again, we have students who are not members of the Student Advisory Board. So we don't create a time for those students beyond public comment. So I'm not sure if it would make sense to open it up. I think the idea is just to have almost a quarterly report of that nature, 5-10 minutes, where you can get an insight into what's going on again, I guess, what's working, what's not, and provide that. But again, we're always open to emails and thought exchange, and we have many different avenues. I think it's a very different approach. It's about the discussion back and forth.
Right.
Is the idea.
Thank you for clarifying. That's what I wanted to be clear, was that I wanted to, if we were going to do this, that I wanted to communicate to all of our employees, should you have something that your group or whoever, or committees or whatever, think is important to tell the board or some sort of celebrate, whatever, that they communicate with you or Dr. Menzel, that they would like some time to get up and discuss what's working in our schools or whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably all the time. I don't know if any groups ever came to you, but I assume that's probably how we would always
Right, but I
handle
mean,
it.
now that if we were to entertain this, that's kind of something similar
Right.
to that.
Right.
Oh, sorry, apologies.
I see it as being thoughtful and proactive.
Right.
Yes.
But I mean, like
Yeah.
a PTO could come
Sure.
and say, guess what? You know what, we just did this
Scottsdale
great thing.
Parent Council could
at our
be,
sc-
you know.
Exactly. And
Right,
so
that's actually another good point, is
And
maybe
that's-
Yeah.
SPC.
That's what I mean, it falls inside that silo is what. Okay.
And SBC might actually be a good addition to that, to do the same
Great.
thing, so that you have students, parents, staff.
Yeah.
But we can discuss that. Board Member Hartwells?
Actually, it's along these lines. I actually was thinking of something more formal as ex officio non-voting members, and I was specifically thinking of SPC and the foundation. There is an interest by myself to have a little bit more two-way communication. You've been great at making yourself available to the SPC meetings, the monthly meetings. And I don't know that, I'm not asserting that we should do this, but I think it's worth considering, and it certainly dovetails nicely with Vice President Sinowski's suggestion of a two-way conversation. How do we start opening up dialogue with multiple stakeholders? And I think those external stakeholders, they do have a connection to SUSD. They're advocacy organizations for the district. They do a lot in connecting with our parent communities. And I think that acknowledging that in a more formal way, it was just something to discuss.
I would actually agree with that. I think there's been often talk in many school districts, and I think there are a couple in Arizona that do this, but it is quite common for school districts to have, for example, student ex officio member or somebody like that, who's there, and potentially, I've not seen it done with others, but certainly parents and staff. But I think maybe expanding the student advisory group model to the SPC and the other associations, so that they each have at least maybe once a quarter or however it would work, 5-10 minutes to speak to us, maybe even the SUSD trust as well, to offer that opportunity to them. Because of course the work with the trust is vital. They help us with many projects, including, for example, our recent build at Saguaro. So I think those are really good points. Are there any further comments on board meeting structure? Anything else that anyone wants to discuss generally, or are we free to move forward?
I guess just rehash where we're at. So
right. So for time,
no study sessions.
No study
sessions. Stay
sessions.
with the 2x2x1s in the committees.
Mm-hmm.
6 o'clock trial.
Mm-hmm.
March, April, somewhere in there.
Correct.
Where are we at with the public comments?
Public comments will go to policy committee
Okay.
for review, because that is enshrined in policy. The city of Scottsdale, we will
Look at alternative date options and kind of test what might work. Look at staff, look at your schedules, kind of see if there are other, because you can be tipping up against somebody else's meeting schedule if we don't look
carefully.
See what makes the most sense, yeah.
So these are changes, again, that probably won't be immediate as of this month, or maybe even March, but they'll be coming down the pipeline soon so that we can at least test trial it. And then a more formal sort of structure with the various stakeholder groups in line with the student advisory group presentations. And we will figure out a way to make that viable so that they don't add to meeting length times, but they provide that opportunity to all of our stakeholders. I think that's a really, really great idea. Some great ideas in discussion tonight.
And I would suggest that could potentially be addressed in the policy committee with BEDB, because that's got the structure of the agenda.
Mm-hmm.
So that's maybe where we could clarify how that process would work.
That sounds good. Is there any further debate?
And then we'd also look at utilizing Zoom and things for staff that may not need to be here, or will we still?
Yeah, well, I think we'll continue to, because we've been relying on technology. I don't see you put that genie back in the bottle.
Okay.
Is there any further debate? Well, thank you very much for that discussion. The board will now move to item 5, consent agenda. The chair moves to approve the consent agenda as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
Board member Beckman seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board approve the consent agenda as presented. Is there any debate? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion carries 5-0. The board will now move to agenda item 6A, leadership team priorities. Dr. Menzel.
Thank you, President Greenberg. As you all recall at our board retreat back in January, which seems like a lot longer ago than it really was, we spent some time looking at priorities for the next 6 months. And I think it's important to kind of couch these in that this is the next 6 months focus, not the focus of the district for the long term. It's about what are we going to prioritize as we get through the balance of the school year. And it was important for the new governing board to have that conversation to talk about as the new governing board, what are the things that you're looking to? And so we start with teaching and learning. It is our priority here at Scottsdale Unified. And specifically, we identified developing and articulating strategies to address learning gaps and the increase in social emotional needs of our students impacted by the pandemic. We also included as part of that developing strategies to recruit and retain high-quality educators and substitute teachers, because we know that in order to improve outcomes for our students, we have to attract and retain top talent in our classroom. Second goal area of focus, which is continuation. Both of these were slightly reworded, but continuation in essence of goals that were established in the first half of the school year. ensure transparency regarding fiscal challenges as they relate to budgetary development aligned with district goals. That last part is the one thing that's a bit of a challenge when we say aligned with district goals, because that's what we're working on, is to develop a strategic plan that will have clear and specific district goals. But I think on the flip side, you've seen in Shannon's presentations that we've been working very hard to be transparent. We actually have software that will allow us to be able to do even more in terms of reporting and making school budget and finance accessible to the general public. And then the third area is communication and messaging. And you can never do enough of this, and there are a lot of opportunities for us to improve. And so we think about how we're engaging with both internal and external stakeholders and developing messages that resonate with our community. But what's not spoken here, but I think was discussed in our conversation, is that other part of marketing in order to attract students back to our schools. And so these will be ongoing things, but priorities for the next 6 months. And so we're ready to implement should you adopt, and I'm trying to speak until 8 o'clock in order to win the bet.
Let's just approve this. All right, discussion. Is there any debate? Dr. Menzel, if I may ask one question. So we do have the previously approved OKRs, if you will.
Yes.
And these are new ones. How do you view that, or how does the board, I should probably ask the board this, how does the board intend to analyze that in relation to performance pay and salary, as well as just generally performance review? Because those are two separate sets. Personally, for me, I don't have an issue combining those in my own head and saying that, we made substantial progress on all these items, or these items, yes, these items, no. But I just want to make sure that we're very clear, especially to Dr. Menzel, what it is that we are expecting him to accomplish. If his focus, on top of everything else going on in COVID, where his focus needs to be any free time he has, weekends, 7 in the morning, whatever, while he's sleeping, are these the items that he should be thinking about? Any comments, Vice President Sanowski?
Yes, I really would like, when you talk about teaching and learning, I would like for us to be thinking future forward, student needs. And I don't know what that looks like to all of us, but I think it's really important that we're not thinking about, it was mentioned earlier today, we're not thinking about going back to the same old, but to be moving forward with better than before, because we can do better, and our students need us to do better. Their jobs are changing, so I really want us to be focusing at their potential jobs. I want us to be focusing on providing an education that is going to be meeting their future needs. And I know it doesn't say that, it talks about the pandemic, and it talks about developing strategies to recruit and retain high-quality educators and substitute teachers. Great, but I think we need to have a more solid teaching and learning aspect right in there.
And I'm wondering if that's really part, at the end of the day, of the strategic planning process.
Yeah.
Of that, looking forward, of not just attracting and retaining, but essentially, as Mark Tucker explains, setting out that goal of what is it that we want students to be able to achieve by a certain grade or certain age, and how do we get there. So
that's it.
I think this covers it, and I think the strategic plan deals with that. But I just want to make sure that as we're approved, Dr. Menzel.
Well, I just want to differentiate. So the governing board, the prior governing board identified three broad goals. Then, pursuant to the contract and state statute, adopted 6 indicators that are weighted for performance-based pay. We haven't discussed revisiting those.
Correct.
As a part of this conversation. So what we're modifying is the broader areas of focus for the leadership team. If there's interest in revisiting the performance-based plan that was addressed, that would be a separate conversation, I think.
I apologize for the confusion. That is my fault, and thank you for clarifying that. Right. The question really is, should should Dr. Menzel be focusing at all on the previous ones? And again, there is some overlap, but there are some differences. Or is it the board's desire that this replace those and that the additional time he does have, that is the focus that Dr. Menzel spends on those items? Board Member Beckman?
Okay, I'm a little confused. We're going to need some clarity here, because are we trying to replace those performance pay goals right now, or are we just focusing on?
We adopted, in addition to the performance pay goals,
Right.
3 categories for areas of focus, which included, for example, the one off the top of my head was implement and develop 3 new programs to address diversity, equity, inclusion, right?
Sure.
So that, if we adopt this, the question is would that, for example, since that isn't specifically listed on here, disappear? And that way, when we're reviewing the work, we go, well, this is what we wanted you to focus on. Does that make sense?
So you're asking then if the goals we're talking about tonight will take precedence over the others?
Correct.
Okay. Well, I think that belies a conversation later on about the performance pay goals and the regular goals, and I'd love to tackle that when we have his evaluation next time, because they're confusing and they kind of conflict with each other sometimes, I think, to your point, I think. But I think the goals we define right now, tonight, that we support are what he needs to be focusing on. We're in a new dynamic at this moment, and I think what we determine right here tonight, as evidenced by this vote, needs to be his focus.
Okay. Is there any further discussion or comment? Board Member Hart-Wells?
So the action is priorities for the leadership team, so Dr. Menzel and the cabinet, and these will set the stage for the end of the school year through June, right? And then there's a bigger scope of the contract. So I'm considering the vote with respect to how we navigate into the end of this school year, given our current realities, which may have been different at the time that these were set back. Fall. Right.
Is there any further discussion, or is everyone's understanding the same? Very well, then. The chair moves to, apologies. The chair moves to approve action item 6A, leadership team priorities, as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
Board Member Hartwell's seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board approve action item 6A, leadership team priorities, as presented. Is there any further debate? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion carries 5-0. The chair moves to adjourn this special meeting of the Scottsdale Unified Number 48 Governing Board at 7:57 p.m. Is there a second?
Second.
Board Member Beckman seconds. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion carries 5-0. The meeting is adjourned. You lost.
By 2 minutes. I might have won by the Price is Right's rule of being the closest.
I was going to, I didn't
Very
notice.
well done. That was the fastest ending ever.
I didn't